Okay. Yeah, already.
So after Andrew's talk on C# a few weeks back, we're delighted to have Scott here to talk about the ASP Plus family of languages. Scott?
Great. Yeah, so basically what I'm going to be talking about today is, so Andrew's, I guess, covered C# and probably some intro to the .NET framework. What I was going to basically talk about today is I'm not sure how much people know about the .NET framework, so we can go really quickly through about 4 slides that just set some background information in case you missed Andrew's talk. I'm basically going to talk mainly about the class libraries, but specifically about ASP Plus, which is basically our class libraries designed for building web applications. Do a quick comparison with sort of the ASP, JSP, CGI state of technology to identify what we thought worked well and what didn't work well. And I'm basically going to delve into code with ASP Plus and show sort of how to build web UI with our new framework, as well as XML-based web services. So for the most part, probably primarily most of the overall presentation is going to be sort of interactive code walkthroughs. I do hope they'll be interactive. There is sort of a script that I'm going to follow along because it just hits most of the things. But there's specific things that you want to see. Raise your hand. Challenge me to write something or show something, and we can sort of go off topic and hopefully tailor to the interest of the audience. So apologize for the next 2 or 3 slides. They're sort of marketing slides I inherited. These are basically at a high level how we positioned ASP Plus and the .NET framework at our PDC conference a couple of weeks ago. Besides sort of being pretty pictures, it sort of just explains sort of the positioning that we're sort of explaining it to developers, which is that fundamentally the .NET framework is really about enabling sort of a 3rd generation of internet development. And we picked the number 3 primarily because number 3 seems to be lucky for us as a company. We're sort of, in the past, web content's really been about static pages and then sort of beginnings of dynamic pages with our WinDNA architecture and with ASP before. What we're really trying to do with .NET is enabling richer browsing, which means providing an opportunity for developers to write code a lot easier, a lot quicker, and a lot more productive. And to scale that to large numbers of clients and applications. In addition to sort of enabling sort of richer browsing UI, though, we're also increasingly going into the sphere that we call web services, which is really about enabling application-to-application and business-to-business communication. We're labeling the overall rubric of this the .NET framework and the .NET platform. So at a high level, really quickly, and then we'll delve into some more technical stuff. In V1, we primarily expect the .NET framework to be tailored towards browser-based clients. Where in V1, we're not assuming any new software delivered on the client. So primarily, we're working against existing browsers, and as well as a new breed of sort of WML or small device cell phones and PDA devices. In addition, though, to supporting sort of standard HTML and WML markup languages for doing UI, though, we're really in V1 looking about empowering a lot of back-end services driven by XML to XML communication. That's going to allow you to take a web application, project it down to a simple client, but do much more complex things on the back end. So with ASP Plus, we have a framework we call Web Forms or System.web.ui, which is specifically about making this radically easier to do. And then we have something we call System.web.services or ASP Plus Web Services, which is specifically about making XML to XML communication a lot easier. We're going to be drilling into code samples and walk through a number of scenarios in a few minutes. In addition to sort of enabling you to build web UI and consume and expose web services of your own, we're obviously also looking to making it a lot easier to integrate with building block services that we as Microsoft provide. Out of the box with ASP Plus, we're doing a lot to enable passport integration. Going forward with V1.1 and V2 of ASP Plus, we expect to basically provide built-in API support to all the building block services that Microsoft provides. So that off the shelf, you can start building distributed web applications in a much easier, quicker delivery schedule. Then going forward in V2, we'll be increasingly looking at supporting richer and richer client devices. Things in the Blackcomb time frame include richer UI, as well as enabling sort of client-to-client communication. So enough. Well, I guess I still have 1 or 2 more marketing slides, and then we'll drill into some more technical depth. So at a high level, you might have seen this diagram. It's sort of we showed the PDC where all the pieces fit together. Specifically, what I'm talking about today is the .NET framework, which is basically our sort of low-level programming environment, programming engine that consists of the common language runtime, which is a new execution environment for running and managing code, and on top of that, a series of base class libraries. Some of them are really basic, like string, collection, hash table, as well as sort of a new data and XML stack, system.data and system.xml, and then a higher level web application and Windows application API library. The web application part of that bucket is basically what ASP Plus is, put it in some context. So high level, how many people actually went to Anders' talk, just so I know? Okay, Anders Halberg, so many people really know the .NET framework in depth. So these slides are going to be useful then. Okay, maybe I'll slow down a little bit. So anyway, so what is the Common Language Runtime? So basically, Common Language Runtime is a multi-language runtime environment that we've sort of been developing for about 3 years. I like to joke it's the only secret we've managed to keep inside the company, at least during the time I've worked here. Basically, it provides a managed execution environment for running code, which means it provides a garbage collector, a unified type object system, as well as a just-in-time compiler. We're taking what we call intermediate language, or IL, and either at runtime or install time, compile those directly into native code and execute. A lot of people sort of like to compare it to Java, or think there's sort of some natural comparisons to Java, the runtime. There are key differentiating points, though. We are a multi-language environment. Out of the box, Microsoft is shipping C++, VB, JavaScript, a new language we call C# as part of our SDK. We've signed up, though, a number of vendors externally that are delivering additional languages, everything from Scheme, Lisp, COBOL, Haskell, Perl, Python, Smalltalk, and we even have one vendor working on something that starts with J. Basically, you can write your code in any language, compile it with any compiler, and it basically emits what we call IL, or intermediate language, which is basically an intermediate instruction language that we can then basically turn into native code. The runtime itself is hardware, language, and OS independent. Our plan is to host this on top of all Windows operating systems. That includes Windows 95, Windows 98, NT4, Win2K, and Whistler. Someone pinged me today and said, what about Win3.1? We're not doing that. But basically, we are supporting all Windows OSs.
Windows CE as well?
Then the question is, so in addition to Windows OSs, we are also supporting what we call a compact version of the framework, which is specifically designed for memory-constrained environments. We've announced we're supporting 3 OSs. One of those is obviously WinCE. 2 are as yet publicly unannounced. One of those is Palm Pilot, and I don't actually know what the other one is. But it is specifically designed to run on a variety of devices. I think Nokia is the 3rd one, but I could be wrong.
How about Unix systems?
How about Unix systems? It is designed to be cross-platform. It's always dangerous when you look in the mirror and there's 15 guys there. I have no idea who they are watching this presentation. It is designed to be cross-platform, though. We are seriously evaluating a port to Linux. I can say that. And we are doing a technical investigation of that. Please don't repeat that. Whether or not we choose to ship it or not is something we haven't made a call on. But there is no technical reason why we couldn't. It is obviously a big engineering effort to do that. Key parts is there is a unified type and object system. This means now if you write code in C++ and use it in JavaScript, or say VB, there's not different types of string objects. There's now one string object that's completely interoperable between the 2 languages. In addition to just sort of making that simpler to sort of interoperate, we also enable true cross-language inheritance, which means you can actually define a base class in C++ or C#, subclass it in VB, override members, add additional members, full works. And it is a truly object-oriented system, so we do have a notion of constructors, properties, events, and methods built into the system. As I mentioned, we do have industrial sync JIT, which can actually execute our just-in-time compiler either at load time, using a sort of standard JIT compiler. We also have what we call an install time JIT, which is whenever you install the software on the system for the first time, we do a one-time JIT, so it's actually native code. It's persisted on disk, so that on subsequent loads of an application, you no longer need to re-JIT it. Someone mentioned about small devices. I should mention we do have 2 flavors of JITs. that we're supporting, and it is pluggable, so you could add your own. One is a standard JIT based on loosely in part some of the C++ backend technology. So it is a very efficient JIT. Most cases, I think it's within 10 or 15% of native code. Sometimes we're even faster, the end result. The C++ team likes us to point out, though, that 10-15% of VC6, they have done a lot of optimizations in VC7, and so in some cases the differential is wider. We'll catch up in subsequent releases. We also have an Econo JIT, which is designed specifically for low memory requirements. So it's not as efficient as the standard JIT, but it's ideal when you only have 20 or 30K to do something with them. What does this mean from a programming model standpoint? It means basically the CRUD of COM is gone. Yeah. GUIDs, class IDs, bug IDs, and nature results are history. We now have a unified exception handling system. You no longer use the registry to register anything. If you want to create something, you no longer use co-create instance. Instead, you use new in the language of your choice. And you say, new foo, it creates a foo object. There is no more I unknown. There is no more add ref, release, or query interface. Instead, you can just directly cast, or you can say, instance of in C#. And because we now have garbage collection, you no longer need to do add ref, release, memory management. There are no more vstrs. We now have a unified string object as well as int, double, float, all the standard types, which means that you no longer have to worry about, I'm programming in C++, but I want this thing called from VB, so I got to create a vstr. There are no longer type libraries, IDL, or COM threading models to think about. Instead, you just write your code, compile it. So any class that you write in C++ is an object that can be consumed in any other language. There is no additional step you need to do to make that possible. The end result is, productivity-wise, you end up writing code again as opposed to IDL or wording about, this is department threaded and I'm being called in an MTA environment. It ends up being, productivity-wise, you're really productive. ASP Plus has been entirely written in C#, and our code base is about 2.5 years old, and I'd say we're at least 4x productive versus teams I've been on in IS and NT. It really makes programming fun again. It also facilitates a really clean object-oriented environment. Unlike COM, where everything was sort of interface-based, you can still use interfaces for contracts, but you also now have the benefit of just sort of defining classes and using those as well. You can use constructors, properties, methods, and events. They're all built into the system. And as I mentioned, there is cross-language inheritance. So the benefit about ASP Plus, we were written entirely in C#. If you want to go ahead and extend our session state architecture, write a VB class, extend our C# base class of session state, add a couple of properties, and resell it. That's perfectly fine. And it's something you can easily do. So it actually really facilitates language and code reuse. So on top of the Common Language Runtime, which sort of enables this environment, we've basically built a set of consistent object-oriented libraries that make development really easy. Things are consistent, which means that the network I/O classes inside system.net look very similar to the file I/O classes inside system.io. Follow very common design patterns, which means that originally the Win32 API followed some design patterns. Over time, over 10 years, there's definitely been. You can look into the APIs and say, oh, that's a little inconsistent, but I know who wrote that, and I understand that. The benefit we've had is that we've had one team and we basically tried to come up with a consistent API end to end. 10 years from now, will it still be consistent? I don't know, but right now it's pretty consistent and clean. All classes and interfaces are organized within a hierarchical namespace. So for example, we have what we call the system namespace, which is the root for all built-in components that we ship with the system. We have the system.data subnamespace, which basically encapsulates everything to do with data. Within that, we then have a SQL subnamespace, which actually encapsulates talking directly to the managed provider for SQL Server and such. What this means is there's no longer language-specific runtimes. There's no longer a VB run. There's no longer MFC. Instead, there's one class library that all languages can go ahead and consume. So what do those namespaces look like, and what's some of the functionality? So in V1, here are basically the top-level namespaces. And I think I've left one or two out that I didn't think were as interesting. But so
what's the delivery mechanism for the common runtime?
What's the delivery mechanism for common runtime? So basically, we'll have a Redis version, an SDK version, as well as a version that Visual Studio will ship.
What happens? How does the common runtime avoid DLL hell?
We'll get to that a little bit later. So yeah, we have a very nice story there. We'll get to that in just a little bit, but yeah. So in terms of namespaces, in terms of APIs, really quickly, system has all the common types, int, double, float, string. It also defines object, which is the root class of all objects within the system. So you can always cast something to object. Collections obviously defines collections, things like arrays, hash tables, dictionaries, etc. Data encapsulates data access. Drawing is basically what we call another name for GDI+, which is basically a whole bunch of managed graphics routines. It's useful both in Win32 apps. It's also server scalable, so you can now do GIF generation, JPEGs, and PNG files. Diagnostics, tons of information for writing the event log, perp counters, WMI. Directory services, go against the directory service. Globalization, for enabling globalization. I/O supports basically a whole bunch of primitives for going into the file system, a whole bunch of objects for specific file API. It also defines a common stream pattern that all of our I/O and other places of the framework consume. So for example, system.net lets you open a stream on top of a socket. System.io has a file object that opens a stream on top of a file, as well as a memory buffer. So the benefit is you can write code that will actually work against any I/O or storage device. Messaging defines MSMQ and our messaging queuing technology, as well as our email APIs. System.net for network access. It is now server scalable and server friendly. Win9 is a problem in the past with not being very robust in the server environment. Sort of fixed that. System.threading, threading primitives, as well as locking and synchronization capabilities. System.text is our regular expression engine. One neat thing about a regular expression engine is it is Lattice profile compatible, but also we're able to take advantage of the runtime, and we provide both an interpreted regular expressions, as well as anything with the runtime is we can actually compile to IL and then JIT it. So we have a way you can actually take a regular expression and compile it directly into native code. You take a few seconds or a second hit to compile it, but it ends up being about 3x faster than interpreted regular expressions. System.reflection lets you do introspection at runtime, basically determine what does this type support in terms of methods, properties, and events. It supports both reflecting and determining what the capabilities of an object are, as well as with something called reflection emit, allowing you to dynamically construct new objects on the fly in memory. So if you have some amount of code that you really want to tweak and you don't want to interpret, you can go ahead and emit a class, compile it, and get back an instance that you can use without having to write anything to disk or invoke this file.
New objects. What about existing objects? Can you change them on the fly?
You can subclass them on the fly. Yeah.
You cannot recompile them on the fly.
I don't believe you can, but I can double check that for you. I believe you hit the subclass. Yeah.
And you've got system.threading, so I think all static data is protected by a lock.
So the question was, is all static data protected by a lock? By default, in terms of our design patterns, all static data is thread safe. It does not mean that it's protected by a lock, though. Where possible, we don't want to have lock contention, and so we sort of design our statics. The goal being this should not take global locks in the system.
So you can't update static data without a lock, right?
It depends on the scenario. Why don't we talk offline?
If it's thread safe, that's fine.
It's thread safe. The short answer is it's thread safe. We can go into more detail.
And transactions are still handled, they still live in COM+?
Transactions are still handled by MTS or COM+.
Okay.
Yeah. Security provides basically code access security in our overall root system. One benefit of runtime is we now support sandboxing of code. This is useful, obviously, in browser environments where you want to download untrusted code from a remote source. It's also very useful for app hosting. So one of the things we're doing with ASP Plus is enabling ASPs, application server providers, to basically support uploading code and actually running it in the server environment. We can actually sandbox that app on the server within a trusted sandbox. Say, you go to these 3 IP addresses, but you can't touch the file system. And we have the ability to do permission set analysis on the code before we execute. WinForms defines basically our Win32 GUI framework. System.xml is our XML APIs, XSLT, XPath, etc., and DOM and parser. Then system.web is what we're going to be talking about today, which is basically ASP+. Questions?
When you download, you have to download in the intermediate language to be able to analyze which APIs are being called.
So the question is, when you download code for a code access security environment, can you download the pre-JITted code, or do you have to download the IL code? And the answer is, to do the analysis introspection, we do require that you actually download the IL. because that way we can actually analyze to see what exactly are you doing before we run it. Otherwise, if it was pre-gitted in native code, you'd run into problems. And one benefit of the IL, though, is that it means that if you're, say, connecting with a 64-bit Whistler box, not in V1, but sort of a couple months after V1, we will have a 64-bit common language runtime that runs native 64-bit, and that way we can actually get the code into native 64-bit instructions. So you don't need to actually compile two ActiveX controls. You can actually just compile it once. Question over there? Yeah.
So if you were talking to a Java crowd, other than the language independence, could you re-highlight what is better or different than Java?
Okay.
That you've covered so far?
Let's do is, if I can say that to the end, definitely ask me at the end. There's things we're going to highlight along the way, like performance, language neutrality, but also I think the richness of our frameworks. We're not trying to duplicate Java in any way. What we're really trying to do is come up with a framework, and I think you're going to see it in a little bit, where we really address building distributed web applications. Which is something that I don't think Java's really, from certain runtime perspectives, they've certainly done some very compelling stuff. But in terms of providing a rich platform for building and deploying and running distributed applications, I don't think they've quite hit, and I think we've actually got a really compelling product that addresses that. So maybe at the end, we can recap that and go into that some more. So that's sort of the background of .NET. Two quick slides on sort of ASP today, pros and cons, and then we're going to really drill into ASP Plus and get to some code. So ASP today, how many people actually use ASP today? Good. That's good. There's nothing worse than having a room of 200 people that have never used your product and explaining why it's good and why it's bad. A lot of blank pages. So basically, ASP today, we have about 1 million customers that actively use it at least on a weekly basis. It's a very successful product for Microsoft. A large part of the success, we think, is basically because it's a very simple and approachable model to use. You don't need any compiler. You don't need to install a tool. This has this sort of nice development model where you can just open up a Notepad file, create a file, hit save, and away you go. It also has some very easy-to-use languages and a pretty simple object model in order to do stuff. And it's got a great developer base, books, conferences, etc. to support it. When we started the project, though, we sort of said, well, ASP has a lot of good stuff about it, and it has a lot of bad stuff. And we sort of started cataloging the bad stuff and trying to figure out, well, how do we actually make this better? One of the first things we sort of identified was that it requires way too much code today to do simple stuff. You want to data bind something, create a little data grid from a database. There's a tremendous amount of code you need to do that. I haven't seen any real e-commerce app or any kind of internet app that doesn't do some form of validation. You got to write code to do that. State management, it's really hard to do today. You got to write code to do that. Not only do you have to write that code, but unfortunately, we really don't have a great model in ASP to reuse it. So as a result, you end up writing kind of the same things again and again and again across different pages, and again and again and again across different apps. Those are key things that we want to try to correct. Other big problem with ASP is you end up quickly writing spaghetti code. Sort of write once, read never. Where you build an app and you go on vacation, you come back and you're like, I have no idea what this does. Partly it's the model. It's a model where you can intermix HTML and code very easily, which makes it simple to do very, very simple stuff. But once you hit a certain point, we're going to walk through, we'll do some samples, we'll do some compare and contrast samples. You reach a point where it really kind of becomes ugly to actually do stuff. There's really no easy way to encapsulate things other than messy include files, which are non-optimal. And in terms of providing page activation, like, for example, you drop a couple buttons on a page, and you want to handle a scenario where a guy clicks on one button, you want to handle a scenario where a guy clicks on another button. There's really no easy, consistent way to actually handle that. Walk through that in a minute. Also, limited language support. We only support script engines today. We have very weak tool support with ASP. Visual Internet has done a lot to try to make that better, but fundamentally they're limited from a graphical layout standpoint by just the fact that if you have an if statement in the middle of your UI, what in the world does a graphical design tool actually do with that? And so, drag and drop wise, they're not really there. Also, in terms of tools, when we think about really professional tools, to build big apps, you need debuggers and profilers. Those aren't there either. We have a pretty confusing security architecture, specifically for internet scenarios today. We want to make that better. Our deployment story today is a real nightmare, as someone mentioned. we have sort of this model where you write a common component and deploy it on a server. All you have to do is go up to the server and actually physically on the server type redsurf32 and stick it in some mysterious directory. The downside is if you're in a server environment, like pretty much it's the only place ASP is used today. Often you don't actually have local access to that particular box. An MSN is way off in Canyon Park is where the actual server machine is. And they don't just let any average developer walk up to the machine and type redsurf32 on it. You want to deploy it across a web farm, we'll just go to all 50 machines and type redsurf32. Now the real downside is if you ever want to update one of those components, obviously COM locks the DLL, so all you have to do is go up to those same 50 machines, stop them first, unlock the DLLs, unregister it, copy the new DLL, re-register it, and then start the machine. The downside is if you have 50 machines in a web farm, suddenly upgrading a simple bug fix becomes a nightmare. And the reality is internet apps today are live. They're never offline. They're never, let's upgrade. There's sort of fluidity to them. You can't say at 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to take Hotmail offline without disrupting tens of millions of people. In addition, we have certain scalability challenges with ASP today, where part of it is sort of inherent architectural problems, part of them are sort of script engine-related problems that we needed to solve. So what is ASP Plus? So ASP Plus has specifically been designed to make it super easy and super powerful to build, deploy, and run web applications. And I sort of want to emphasize those three key parts. If you don't hit all three on the head, you really don't have a great platform for running and deploying production apps. So we've done a lot throughout the framework to make it easy for all three things. We are based entirely on the common language runtime, which means we can actually use any common language runtime programming language within a page. So out of the box, we support VB, C#, and JScript inline compilation. All those other languages I mentioned, Scheme, Lisp, Smalltalk, COBOL, etc., are also supported with third-party add-ons. And so the PDC, it's kind of surreal. You can see an ASP Plus page written in COBOL. And people were like really jazzed by that. It was kind of weird. But anyway, you can use any programming language. And because common language runtime never interprets anything, that is a key differentiating point of Java. We always get into native code. It means we get much better, improved execution performance. We have a new page programming model called web forms I'm going to be delving into in a few seconds, which makes it a lot easier to build dynamic HTML and WML UI. We have much richer XML features, which makes it sort of super simple to expose and consume programmatic XML services. We're going to build those in a few minutes. Xcopy FTP deployment. So I mentioned sort of the nightmare of common deployment. Basically, our model of ASP Plus is copy an app into a directory on a server, and you're done. There are no utilities. There is no more redsurf32. There is no admin tool. We actually cut admin tool support from V1. That's how optimistic we were. You no longer register components. Instead, basically, we have what we call bin directory immediately under your app root. Copy any .NET assembly into that. It's automatically registered for that application. You want to delete from the system? Delete the file. There is no more registry GUI. There is no central registry you need to worry about. For a production server environment, we no longer lock any DLLs on the server. Which means if you want to update running code that's compiled code on the server, create the new DLL, copy it over the old one. We'll automatically detect the change, spin up a new instance of the app, direct all the requests to the app, drain requests from the old app, and then nuke the old app. There is no admin tool required. There is no kicking the system to make it happen. Copy it and go. That's true for code. That's true for dynamic pages and services. It's also true for configuration. We now have an XML-based configuration environment. Just update the file, hit save, you're go. Yep.
Can you give a really quick definition of an assembly?
Good question. What's an assembly? So basically, an assembly is effectively a deployed compiled unit. So it has a .dll extension, but it's basically a whole bunch of classes that you can compile down into a single file, essentially. And you can assign those to give them trusted permissions and yeah, good. We have a lot better reliability and recovery support. Basically, our goal is we should never appear down. So we have things like memory lock and deadlock, memory leak and deadlock detection built into the product. Walk into some of those in a few minutes, or 20 or 30 minutes. And then lastly, we have great, fantastic Visual Studio Designer support.
Question.
Yep.
Right before that last comment, did did you say that you have an XML-based declaration of the range of things that you want to update? Like I run a website.
Okay.
You were saying that if I want to update that website, it's not just like this one bin, it's like a whole set of code that I've got to transfer over.
So we don't actually have an XML file that describes everything. You can certainly create your own as like sort of a manifest.
So how do I do like a major update as opposed to a minor update?
So how do you like transact 20 resources at a time?
Right.
Right. So App Center will, as a product, will enable you to do that either on a local machine or across a box.
And that's an OS-based.
That's actually sort of an add-on product. That's one of those sort of .NET Enterprise servers.
Add-on?
Yeah, it's sort of an enterprise, or not an enterprise, but sort of an add-on that works in a web farm or a single box scenario. It's got a lot of management.
So that's an admin type tool.
That would be an admin type tool to help if you want to sort of replicate everything and sort of say, then turn it on, and have like 50 machines go live at once.
So I want to understand one other thing, which was you were saying that when App Center does that, it will take all the things that are currently in the queue with the currently deployed resources and let those finish out.
Right.
And then it'll
So
bring those new resources in.
So ASP Plus actually will handle that. So ASP Plus will automatically handle finishing all the current requests and then send all new requests to the new app. What App Center basically does is it very quickly changes the directory. And so that's basically their step, is they'll just sort of rename the old directory and change the new directory very quickly. And so there is a split second where you might have a conflict, but that's essentially what they're doing on their side. But ASP Plus will basically provide the infrastructure to automatically version those things. Yes.
So the deployment question, I think I saw PDC, I want to just clarify this and verify it. Is it true that in the new world that you're no longer dependent on binary standards, so that if you add a new method in the front of what would have been the V table, that no longer causes any problems when it's swapping things out?
Yes, the question was, you're no longer dependent, are you still dependent on binary V tables? So for example, if you have a base class called, foo, a class foo that had a method bar, and you subclass it with Baz, and you add Zap. And then at a later point, whatever, I'm losing track of these. The later point, you actually add another member to that base class. Will the subclass version break? And the answer is no. We're not. Now, having said that, if you define an interface with 4 methods, and a class actually implements that interface, and you actually, for some reason, modify the interface contract, then that guy does have to, at some point, add that next method, or else you get a conflict. That's just because it's violating his contract.
But positionally, it doesn't.
Positionally, that's not the problem. It's just that it's violating the contract. But if you have a base class and you add stuff, you have no problems.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Still related to cop deployment. If you have an instance of a component and you deliver a new DLL, I understand that new instance of that new component will be based on the new DLL, but the existing instances will still be from the old DLL.
So the question is, for running an app, if you replace the component, basically, and so the question is, what happens to the old instances? Basically, we run them in what we call an app domain, where all the old code still runs, and we basically let them complete the requests and then drain. And then basically we'll instantiate instances inside the new app domain with all the new code that runs. So they never end up running in the same logical space. So I was going to mention quickly highlight sort of performance. One big win in addition to all those other features that I mentioned is we perform pretty well. We are still pre-beta, so we anticipate our performance to improve. But right now, we're currently seeing on a 4P box about an 8x improvement over JSP, which is the Java Enterprise product, and about a 3.5x improvement, this chart's a little over our ASP equivalent on a 4P box, using a MSN homepage sort of production scenario. And we are seeing some nice scaling on 8-way CPUs, which is something that we don't have in this chart, but which is historically ASP has never done particularly well at.
But what I'm seeing here is saying that you get 150 on a single, under 300 on a double, which is not bad. But by 4-way, you're at 400. I mean, that's pretty poor scaling. At that point, you're only 60% of the CPUs.
So we are seeing right now.
Would be awful.
So on Baybird,
anyway would be awful, it probably worse than that.
It's actually, so a little clarification is, we have this thing called web gardens. So for 8-way, basically, we have the ability to basically clone an app so that we actually run the app separately on each process. We have basically 8 processes, and we'll finitize each one to a CPU. And so as a result, you eliminate cross-processor lock information. And what we have found for 8-way CPUs, that's really how you get some scaling.
You do partition.
Yeah. And we are, yeah, but to be fair, in terms of our 4-way CPU number, the overall absolute number is larger than ASP and JSP, but you're quite right in the sense that we do have some work in terms of scaling. We just changed our thread pool because we've been seeing starvation on a 4P, and so that isn't reflected in these numbers. So that's why it's still pre-beta. We are going to get better. But the nice thing is we are smoking our competition now. So in terms of the overall ASP Plus platform we're talking about, basically logically I think of it in terms of 3 buckets that I'm going to be talking about today. One is basically our infrastructure for building web UI or web pages dynamically. Another sort of infrastructure for building what we call web services. And then the third is sort of common infrastructure bucket, things like session state, caching, deployment, configuration, security, that basically is common across both pieces. So what I'm going to talk about first is sort of web pages, and then we'll delve into the rest a little bit later. So one more slide, and then we'll go to code. So our goal with overall web UI is to make it dramatically easier to build dynamic pages. Fundamentally, in terms of UI, we're not doing anything dramatically new. The end result that a person sees in the browser is still, it feels like a regular web page. The difference is in terms of the amount of code that you end up having to write is dramatically simpler. The code that you end up having to write is dramatically cleaner. In addition, we're trying to make, the way we're doing this is by simplifying a lot of the common tasks. And we'll be walking through code examples in a minute. Validation, data manipulation, state management, post-back of values. Making it just a lot cleaner and a lot easier to code those things. We're also making it a lot easier to support different clients. ASP Plus out of the box works with Mosaic 1.0 on Linux just fine. And that's sort of a test requirement that we actually want to make sure we ensure. But we also want to provide built-in support, so it makes it really easy to leverage richer browsers, whether they're Netscape or IE. So if they can take advantage of DHTML, it'd be great if the developer didn't even have to think about it, but automatically they can take advantage of it. We'll see some examples in a minute. The end result is sort of a much easier way to have richer UI. In addition to targeting sort of up-level browser clients, we're also providing support. David Kurtlander's AUI team is actually building a whole set of support for ASP Plus, specifically to target for cell phones and small devices. So at the same time, when we're trying to scale up to richer browsers, we're also trying to scale down to sort of WML devices with 4 lines of text. The key way we're doing this ASP Plus is by introducing a new server-side UI control model. Basically, the idea here is you can actually drop components, or what we call controls, onto an ASP Plus page. You do that with a declarative tag. You can set attributes on it. It has sort of a run at equal server attribute, which identifies it to our parser. We instantiate this thing at runtime, and it can participate in the overall request processing of the page. Which means it can render any content at once into that location, but it can also participate in what we call the post-back process of the page. Meaning it can automatically update its values from the client. So if you have a text box, it will automatically update its text property with whatever was typed in the client the next time the browser hits the page. As a result, programmers can program directly against these server controls to richly to basically encapsulate a lot of the disgusting details that they have to deal with today. Key benefit is there's zero coding now required for a lot of common scenarios. We're going to walk through those in a second. From an enterprise level, one of the things we're trying to do with this model is sort of enable what we call VB for the web, which is in the same way that sort of VB made Windows programming really easy back in sort of 91, 92. We're trying to do the same thing for web programming, which is, today to build a real rich web application, you got to understand a variety of different things. HTTP, HTML, security, configuration, deployment, post-back, hidden fields. We're trying to sort of provide a really nice encapsulation model that makes it really super easy for people that are not necessarily web developers or web developers that haven't mastered everything to go ahead and be productive. At the same time, though, we want to make sure we get the full richness and expressiveness of HTML so that basically the UI doesn't end up looking like VB. And on top of this, we have sort of a rich extensibility model so that ISVs can go ahead and innovate in a really easy fashion. So I'm going to do 2 things here. go ahead and start with a very simple page. That page. Avoid me having to type everything in front of you. A little template there. So basically what I'm going to do here is start with a really simple kind of no-brainer page. It's just static HTML here. Basically took an HTML page and I renamed it .aspx, which is our extension that we use for ASP+. We're actually probably going to change this to be .page, just because we have a variety of extensions which are getting sort of wackier and wackier, or more cryptic. Basically, any HTML page at its foundation can start off as an ASP+ page. Partly because the extension is different from ASP, it means that we can actually run side by side with ASP on an existing box. So if you're doing production development with ASP and you're like, oh, I don't want to mess it up, no problem. You can install ASP+ and we run perfectly fine. Separate file extensions, separate configuration options. So there's no problem with having them coexist. Key thing is that with ASP+, you can still do the angleback percent inline code that ASP made popular. So for example, with ASP, it's very common you'd say angleback percent, do a little loop, spit something out. That still works. Just hit save and it goes ahead and compile. The neat thing here though is that we're not actually running the VB scriptage. In ASP, if I took that page, it would work just as it did, but it would actually end up using VB script under the covers to go ahead and execute and compile this thing. What we're actually doing under the covers here is using the real VB7 compiler, generating IL, getting it into native code at runtime, and executing that. The end result is much faster and improved execution. It also means that we actually now, whereas VB script is a typeless model, I can now say dim I as integer. So here some people go, wow, and other people go, what the hell is up with that? If you're familiar with ASP though, yeah, that basically just means it's sort of an internal, or it ends up meaning it's an early bound call, which means you get even better performance and better compile time check.
Question.
Yeah.
Does that also mean that because you're using the VB7 engine, does that give you access to the rich set of API commands that VB?
Yeah, it does give you full access to VB. It also gives you full access to all the common language runtime libraries. So system.data, system.net, what have you.
Like new ADO instead of new server.create object.
Exactly. So server.create object, you no longer have to use, you can always say new, and away you go. Also means you can basically, in addition to using VB, you can also now use C#. So, I equals 0, 8. Away you go. So you have the full flexibility. You had COBOL. You go for COBOL. I know a lot of you are as your C code.
Are you compiling the whole page, or do you have a piece of compilation here and there?
So it's a good question. Are we compiling the whole page, or what exactly are you doing on the covers? Well, one thing, just to show, let's actually create a syntax error. So what this is actually doing it's amazing in the class every time we do that. It's going to show me the line that got broken. The other thing we actually do right now, and we're debating whether or not to keep it, so you actually want to see what we actually generate.
Oh, yeah.
You can actually see the original source file. So this is obviously machine generated, which is why indentation and stuff is kind of weird. And you can sort of see these are fragments so that for debugging purposes, if you actually launch a debugger, we'll actually resolve the debugging step to the original line inside the ASPX. So the debugger you just step through, you don't actually see any of that generated code. If you want to see what we actually pass to the compiler and get back, you can see that.
Do you actually generate, from the point of view of code generation underneath the covers, you're actually generating an amount for one compilation unit?
Yes.
Treating all the literals as if it's some kind of string substitution as a response or something?
Yeah. It's kind of, once we get the controls, it gets even wackier, what the code we end up generating. But it's kind of interesting to walk through kind of all the twists and turns that we have to do to make everything work.
And you handle all the
Compatibility stuff.
web farm, web farm, you handle all the state session management. There's a lot of tricky stuff involved.
No, actually, state stuff is not quite as goofy. Getting any right percent to work inside a control tree, that's goofy. But it does work, and we do it for compat purposes.
Question.
Yeah.
Can you mix two languages in the same page?
The question is, can you mix two languages within the same page? The answer is unfortunately no. That is our biggest compatibility issue.
Because you provide the final...
Because basically we are compiling a class now. Now what we do allow you to do though is we do have a technique that I'm not going to show today, but I can show a little bit later for people that are interested. Ways that you can actually easily define what we call pagelets, which are basically page fragments, and those can be in separate page languages. So it's not like, oh, everything has to be rewritten, although there is some steps that you need to take. We are going to have a porting tool which will help automate that. A key thing just to keep reinforcing is we run side by side with ASP. So that's why we can not be 100% compatible, but try to be sort of 92% compatible, which means that nothing's going to work, but it's at least a little step away to actually getting it to work.
Pagelets can be cached?
Yes. Yeah. The only key thing to mention is that we are actually persisting the actual compiled unit to disk, which means actually if, for example, your worker process restarts or your machine restarts, we don't recompile. We only recompile if the file changes. That's not true in the PDC bits, but it is true in Beta 1. Other thing to mention, I can't actually show right now, though, is that this is sort of a compile error. We also now actually, for ASP Plus, with common language runtime, we have the ability, when you actually compile a file in debug mode, we can actually resolve file and line number, as well as column number, no, not column, line and file references for any exception that occurs. So you'll actually see something very similar to this when, say, a null reference exception occurs. So instead of getting a heap corruption, you'll actually see a nice little red line that says, ooh, null reference exception. Here was the actual point in your code that actually generated it, which should make debugging a lot easier. That's true for both page code as well as business object code. Will make life a lot easier. Since there are a few ASP developers in the room, I'll show one other thing really quickly that they'll probably like. How many people use response.write for debugging? You're going to like that. So we now do have a really nice debugger, which I'll show later. We also have what we call a trace statement, which basically allows you to call the trace API within your page of the lead for or left for whatever. Basically, what this is going to execute, but nothing happened. That's because trace mode wasn't on. So we basically just compiled after those things. They become no-ops. The nice thing, though, is if you actually enable tracing for the page, trace equals true. We'll go ahead and execute the page, and at the bottom of the request is some tracing information. We can actually give not only your statements, the actual will give you, the granularity isn't quite right now, but actually timings in terms of when they occurred. Cookie collection, header collection, server variables, and requests. Yep.
Something that was funny was you had tracing off by default, right? But when there was an error in the page, you popped everything right up.
Yeah. So,
is this sort of, isn't that a little inconsistent?
so we had tracing off by default? Sorry?
Tracing was off, right?
Yeah, tracing was off, yeah.
Nothing but syntax. But when you had the syntax error, if I'm writing my ASP plus script, I don't particularly want to see my customers getting all the error information.
So good question. So there's a couple things. So one is the errors, we do have the ability to basically do what we call custom errors. So we'll actually have a nice page. So instead of saying, you have a syntax error on this line, it'll say like, oh, sorry, the app is unavailable. Please try again, or something, something like that. So that actually protects you from showing ugly messages. And we have actually recently changed so that it doesn't say ASP plus error at the top. There's only worse than having the exec on stage and like it says ASP plus error, and they instantly go, oh, ASP plus blew up, and you go, no, don't say that. It's a compiler. The other thing though is, so to answer your question, how do I actually avoid that trace garbage being dumped at the bottom of my page? The nice thing about having the trace stuff is you can look at it, but say for example I want to give it off to someone in test, and I want them to actually execute the stuff without seeing this junk at the bottom. So we do have an option, disable trace, for a page, but then enable it for an app. This means, we'll talk about configuration file in a minute. What this basically means is you go ahead and end up using your app just as you would. There's no tracing information shown. But within that app, there's a trace URL that you can hit. And what that will basically do is list all the traces for that app. So we got 5 there. 2 more accumulated. Click on any details to see trace information for that request. So you can actually go through an entire scenario and then walk back and say, okay, what actually happened? That was just sort of...
So what happens if you have a compilation error on your page? You get a page back that says that you've got a compilation error, or you see the substitute page that you provided. Is there any way of notifying anyone that that page is busted?
Yes, so there is. Actually, while we're messaging, is there someone who knows how to turn that back on? Seem to be okay on that side. Is there anyone, AV person in the room?
Knock on the door.
We'll let them. So while they're fixing that, so yes, there is an application error event that you can sync, and so there's I can show you. There's basically a really neat way you can sort of send an email right to an event log, and you can basically log the exception trace for any page. So you can actually mail to the administrator, oh, here's the exception that occurred on this URL with these inputs. So they can go ahead and figure out what the problem is and continue on from there. So while we're working on that, let's maybe answer 2 or 3 questions, then we'll...
Is that trace a class part of the framework?
Yes, trace is a class as part of the framework. So not in beta 1, but in beta 2, you'll be able to call that from within the object. So even from a business object, you can go ahead and call trace that right.
And it exists in all the different languages.
It exists in all the different languages you can take advantage of. That's one of the big benefits of the common language runtime is that, we can write all this stuff once, and it's not just for script, it's not just for VB, or not just for C#, it's for any language out there to take advantage of. So, there's no way you guys can see that, right? No, really. Any ETA on that, or should we answer a few more questions, or? Okay.
This stuff's just too hot.
Lightning in a bottle. I'll tell you what. Why don't people move a little bit over there, and we'll go off this one for a little while, and then we'll come back. So other quick questions I can answer while we're doing the fire drill here.
A couple of questions.
Yep.
If you have trace turned off, does any compiled code get generated? Is there any impact hit?
Yeah, the question is, if trace is turned off, what's the impact of having trace set write statements? So not in beta 1, but in beta 2, we'll basically conditionally compile those statements. Which means if tracing is off, there is no impact. The compiler will just no-op it. Or the runtime will just no-op it when they JIT it. Now, having said that, you do need to be careful. There's a trace file. Right? Okay. Sorry about that. There's a trace.isEnable property. So if you're going to go ahead and compute some expensive thing and then call trace.write, you want to wrap that in trace.isEnable so that you don't do that. Yep.
So are you shipping with VS7 or before? I heard a rumor that you were thinking about shipping.
So right now our schedules are aligned together.
Okay.
But we have no technical dependency. Right. But it is just sort of right now we are aligned together. So anyway, moving on. So that's a little world. Bring that back. So what I want to actually do with this page, though, is I want to do something a little bit richer, which is not do hello world. I want to basically enter some input, and ultimately I'm going to go against the database and generate some output. And eventually we're going to build this up into a storefront for an e-commerce app. Now, right now I'm just doing standard HTML, and I'm posting back to the same page the values. I'm not executing any code, so obviously I get back the same HTML. Raises an interesting point, which is you'll notice that the values inside the text box and drop down are actually lost, and that's because it's a standard HTML. And unless I actually write server-side code, they're never going to be maintained. Now, with ASP today, not that hard to write this code. It's pretty simple. Few lines. But it's kind of gross. I got to put code right into my tag. Front page really likes that. Just declare an array. Loop over it. No problems there. Figure out which one's selected, emit that. And then when I want to figure out whether I'm hitting the first time of the page or whether I'm doing a postback, I'll just stick an if statement around my little hi statement. End result is simple, kind of, I guess. It gets the job done, but at the end of the day, the code that I needed to write to do that is a little less than optimal. So how do I do this with ASP+? Well, that was with ASP+, using sort of ASP's angle bracket percent syntax. What I'm going to do instead, though, is let's actually go back to the original HTML. And instead, I want to take the HTML and basically drop on these server controls that I talked about to help automate this process. So what is a server control? Well, basically, a server control is a tag with a run@server attribute on it. So if I say run@server, that makes it a server control. I can actually take any HTML tag and apply a run@server attribute to it, and now it's programmable on the server. Which means if I give it an ID, like for example that input text box, I can then actually program it directly against its object model, like I would a control or a component on the client, or a server.create object component on the server. In addition to allowing me to program in standard HTML controls, we do also have what we call sort of web controls, which to some extent overlap a little bit in functionality. So like text box, button, drop down, unfortunately do have some overlap, but are richer to include things like data grid, calendars, advertators, etc. And basically what they provide is sort of a more cleaned up object model, we like to say, with a more consistent object model for the framework.
And that must run at server, of course.
Yeah, that must run at server. So what I'm going to do right here to begin with is I'm just going to use the sort of, we call the cleaned up controls. Where instead of having, CSS and other ways to do things, it sort of has a more consistent, encapsulated approach. Drop these on the page. And basically go ahead and execute that page again. The first thing I want to show is the blank HTML. This is the HTML we have, the original content. And we do have some indentation problems, so bear with me a little bit. But for the most part, you'll notice we're just spitting back standard HTML. There is no client-side JavaScript used at all. And there is no Java applets, and there is no ActiveX controls used at all on the page. The only sort of magic thing we have right now is we do spit out the hidden field. We call the state that we actually can use to basically round trip information. So in this case, we're just round tripping basically a unique sort of grid-like thing that basically lets us version the page and figure out what page, what version of the page has been modified as the grid changes. Just standard stuff. We're not storing anything on the server. We never store anything on the server with web form. So it means it works great in web farm. There's no timeout issues. It scales wonderfully. But now I didn't write any code. But now that I've declared these guys as server controls, they've emitted standard HTML. One thing you'll notice when we actually go back to the server is we'll automatically maintain their values within the HTML. So whereas before I had to write a lot of code, or if I didn't write any code, they'd just be lost. These values in these controls, when we instantiate them on the page, they'll say, well, my name is name, I'm a text box. Let me look at the HTTP request to see if someone has actually entered something in the client for the name text box. And as a result, if they have, they'll automatically populate the text box's text property with the appropriate value. Now what will happen is a programmer within code on the server can go ahead and then access and manipulate that text box value. If they don't change it though, the text box is just going to spit out its value and render it like it does. And that's what's happening here. So it's automatically maintaining its state. Hit view source. Again, with the exception of the indentation problem, you'll notice it's just the same HTML we have. All the controls did was automatically stick their value out in the appropriate place on the page. So that's kind of pretty boring. Let's actually figure out, well, how do I actually program against this thing and do something interesting with it? So we've done the state management part. What we're going to do right now is I'm going to drop a new control on the page. I'm going to call it labels. And I give it an ID called message. It has an ID, which means I can programmatically access it on the server. And a label, it turns out, has a text property, which means I can actually set its text property to control what gets displayed, again, programmatically on the server. Now, I can do that either with an angle bracket percent block, like ASP is used to today, or alternatively, and this is actually how I'm going to do it, I'm going to go ahead and actually take advantage of a new event that we've exposed in ASP Plus called the page load event. This gets called when the page loads on the server. There's a corresponding event called page unload that gets called at the end when the page unloads from the server. It basically provides a clean way that, today, if you want to actually have code that executes at the beginning of the request, you sort of stick it at the very top of the page. If you want to have something that executes at the end of the request, you just sort of stick it at the end of the page. This provides a much cleaner way that you can basically participate and say, oh, I want to run this code every time the page loads.
So the end of the request is right before you render it?
No. So the page unload gets called actually after render. So it's basically used really only for scenarios where you want to clean up a database connection or log something to disk or something like that.
So if I have to do a bunch of code that generates a bunch of UI that's expensive, that I don't want to do if I'm going to respond to a redirect somewhere else, is there a separate event for that?
So if you do that, so basically the question is, what if I want to do a whole bunch of code, but say for scenario I actually want to respond to a redirect somewhere else? We have a page.navigate method now, and if you do that, we'll basically send out the response.redirect, and then we'll terminate the request, which will guarantee that your code, it will basically call unload on everything, but will guarantee that no other code executes.
So is there another event that gets called if I know I'm actually going to render it to the client?
Yes, there's a pre-render event.
Pre-render, okay.
Yeah. Sort of a more advanced feature, but yeah. So what I'm going to do inside this page load is pretty simple. I'm just going to write some code that says, updates the message.text property to say, hi. And we'll pull out from the name text box that value and say, hey, you selected. And we'll pull out from the drop down, it's called category, the value typed in there. Ooh. And showing rich errors. So now when I say Fred, soda, spits out that message. Not incredibly exciting, but sort of hello world in a much cleaner way. Yep.
How did it know that name was an object? What if you created an object? Is there like some kind of scope resolution?
Sure. So you're saying, how do we know that message was an object?
Message and name and category.
Right. So basically, any server control that you declare on the page, the top level item, like this, basically is automatically added into the scope of the page. It's a class member.
And what if you created your own class called message?
I mean, like you actually have a local variable called message?
Yes.
You will actually, so if you declare, like, say, dim message right above this function, you will actually get a compiler that says, hey, you got to choose one or the other. It's a redeclaration. So you do need to make sure that you have sort of unique names there. You don't have to give something an ID, in which case they'll have a random number, So you don't have to come up with 30 unique names unless you want to program it in something else. So this is a little world. So a couple of things I want to point out. One is this is running inside the page load event, which is, it's a clean way. With one line, I can do what used to take sort of 10 lines. Now, the downside here right now, of course, is that it's executing every time I execute the page, right? So because it's page load. So it happens the first time that I hit the page where I haven't typed any values in yet. Ideally, I only want it to execute when that button gets clicked. So how do I do that? Well, one way I can do that is basically, instead of syncing the page load event, now basically I can sync any event I want off of any object, any control on the page. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is change this from being page load to instead sync a click event off that server control button. So it's only going to execute when that button gets clicked. So now, the first time I load the page, that code doesn't get executed. Now when I do, it does.
There's no implicit.
So use closing.
Right now, you explicitly attach it. Because not all languages support automatic name updates. VB does, but...
Can you view source that?
Sure, let's view source it.
Button now, or?
So what happens? So is there any client to JavaScript? No. Basically, imagine that's indented. You just have, the label just emits a span. There is no state being stored on the server. So you end up having, once you get the indentation problem, a very clean HTML page. There is no magic script library, there's no ActiveX control, there's no Java applet. And if you want, we can hit it with Netscape.
So what do you want to do if you want to localize the label for the button?
So the question is, when do you want to localize the label for the button? So there's a couple of strategies you can do. We do have a resource manager model in V1 so that you can actually externalize your messages so that you can easily localize things. It means you can localize either the template or the code. Now, unfortunately, in a resource manager in V1, you have to write if you want to do really rich stuff, you end up having to write code. We do have plans in V1.1 to provide a much richer XML-based resource manager that'll actually allow you to localize things not just according to language, but also customize based on categories that you define. So we talk to people like Dell, and they're like, we want to have enterprise resources and small business resources, and actually, basically customize content on that dimension as opposed to sort of culture.
And you do the work to match up the name that gets posted back, which is the label to whatever the ID tag is.
You'll see a little bit how we can actually separate out the code entirely. So let's keep sort of hanging here. Netscape has a wonderful bug, which is, unfortunately, I'm not on the network right now, so it ends up hanging on DNS resolution when you post back for about 4 seconds, and then it goes. I don't understand why. But basically, this is showing you in Netscape, it works just fine.
Are you forcing a refresh just because of the version doesn't know how to detect date stamp differences and keep editing the file and you have to keep changing the parameters? Yeah, so we actually do automatically refresh. I just do that so I don't get that little pop-up that says, do you want to post it?
So the neat thing about our control architecture is we have about 45 controls that we ship in the box. And so as a result, you can basically drop these guys down here and take advantage of rich stuff in a really easy way. So if I want an ad rotator, I drop the ad rotator control down, and away I go. If I want a data grid, I drop the data grid down, and away I go. We'll see an example of that in a little minute. The nice thing, though, is it's a really extensible model, though, so that anyone can go ahead and create their own server controls. So what I'm going to show right here is basically a server control that I put together. I call the Acme calendar control, for lack of an interesting name. So I can register it with an XML namespace. Drop it down in my calendar, give it a run equal server. I'm going to give it a programming ID called mycal. And now I have a little calendar on my guy here. Go change it, type some stuff in. And if I want to, let me go back and modify the code. And say, hey, you selected this on mycal.date. It's going to spit out the date property of the currently selected calendar. Not incredibly exciting, but the neat thing is once you have this rich library of components you can take advantage of, you can start dragging and dropping stuff and building some stuff pretty rad. We'll see some examples in a minute how you can customize the UI in a rich way. One thing I just want to point out first, though, is you'll notice as I'm clicking around this calendar, I'm not round-tripping back to the server. And that's because we have built-in capabilities of the framework that control vendors can take advantage of to figure out, does the browser have up-level capabilities? And if so, what are those up-level capabilities? In this case, the controls detected, I'm hitting it with IE, so it's actually going to be emitting a DHTML behavior. And so as a result, I don't have to round-trip when I change the GUI on this little control. I only have to round-trip when I hit that button to execute the code to do something with it. Now, of course, obviously on down-level browsers, I can't do that necessarily because they might not support DHTML. The nice thing, though, is that if I wanted to, the control could automatically round-trip and handle the result on the server and repaint the page using just standard HTML 3.2. The benefit from a page developer, though, is the programming model is identical. They don't have to write their code and tailor it, with giant if statements. The controls can hide a lot of that up-level, down-level encapsulation. Yeah.
How is the calendar object included into the client.html?
So in this particular case?
Or in general, I mean, you tend to iframe things and dump them in text.
We tend to basically just dump it into the text. I'm going to show in a little bit how we actually have, for up-level clients, what we call sort of automatic repaint of the screen. So only that region will actually change, which I think they'll like, and we should see in a little bit. Yeah?
Do the controls up-level versus down-level occupy the same layout space?
It depends on the control. So all of our controls that we ship with the product do work down level. And they do actually have the equivalent layout space as up-level controls. Now, we're also, the IE team is actually working on a set of 10 to 15 controls that they're also going to be shipping. What they're going to do is they're going to really show off the power of DHTML, but they're also going to have down-level versions. And so the big benefit is they can say to their customers, you can take advantage of DHTML today with IE 5.5 or IE 6, and not have to wait until you get broad adoption, because just use it on a page, you'll get automatic down-level support for your other clients as well. So this is kind of boring. I said at the beginning I want to actually go ahead and do some database stuff. So let's actually just nuke that, because it's not really database stuff. Instead, what I want to go ahead and do is I want to use that button click, take those values that were typed into those text box and drop down, go against the database, and do some database-driven UI. To begin with, I'm just going to start simple and drop a data grid on my page to take advantage of it. Give it an ID of my list. Run it equals server, and I'm going to set a couple background styles on it to configure what the UI appearance looks like. Then basically, I showed those namespaces at the beginning of all the framework's namespaces, and I touched on two of them, system.data, which basically encapsulates our generic data access APIs, or ADO+, and system.data.sql, which encapsulates what we call managed SQL provider, which is basically an API for doing really efficient data access to SQL Server. And then basically what I'm going to do within here, this click, is instead of updating a text box, I'm going to go ahead, use the data access APIs, execute a SQL command, take the results, and I'm going to bind it to that data grid and then cause it to render. The end result, when I select soda products, it's a simple little grid. Kind of an ugly grid, but it's a simple grid. And obviously it works in Netscape. Hang. I remember when Netscape just rocked. We were afraid of them once.
You don't have to line your control Netscape and
No, it didn't even hit the server. It looked for DNS and it doesn't get me. But anyway, so as I mentioned, this UI sucks. We could set properties, I could change colors, I could make it look really cool. It was nice that I only had to drop one tag down, but fundamentally this kind of looks like 1993 UI. It looks like a grid control that I would expect in a pretty boring form. It's good for quick and dirty stuff, but it's not incredibly exciting. As I mentioned earlier, one of the key things we want to make sure we do is not have UI that sucks, but instead basically be able to take advantage of the full expressiveness of HTML. So originally what we did was we said, oh, we'll just create tons and tons of controls. And we very quickly had a couple different data grids that looked different. What we found, though, is you can't really anticipate as a control developer exactly how your developers really want the UI to look like. And so instead of duplicating tons of controls with different looks and feels, what we basically set back and said was, let's come up with an extensibility mechanism so that a consumer of a control can go ahead and skin or templatize what the UI looks like. So they can control what the look and feel looks like, and the control developer just has to implement the implementation once and can basically delegate off the look and feel to someone else. So the way you can do this is basically provide what we call templates. So I'm going to provide, and a control can basically support any number of templates that they want. So there's no built-in ASP Plus number of templates. So this particular template control supports what we call an item template, which allows the user to customize what each item in the list looks like. A calendar control could expose the calendar, the day template and the weekend template. It's up to the control developer to expose what they want. The end result, though, is without changing the code or the data, but just changing the template, you get a radically different look and feel. This particular control here lets me control the column. So if I want to change it to be single column mode, I don't know if I do that, but I can do that. Change the width, the height, whatever. The nice thing is, the look and feel is encapsulated within that template. It can either be defined inline or it can be defined in external files. So for a large enterprise app, you can envision a couple site designers defining the templates that will be used on all pages. And they can just link to it from within specific pages. The benefit of using the templates is then someone could say, well, I like that control, but boy, I want to change the templates dramatically. So same control, same data, same code, different templates. Here I'm going to define another item template, but also separator, footer, and header template. And as a result, again, radically different look and feel. Same control, same data, same code, completely different look and feel. Works up level and down level.
What's the % hash operator?
That's basically a data binding syntax. So it's a way you can actually, at data bind time, execute some code within a template. And as I just mentioned, you can put any number of controls you want within a template, so you can do full hierarchy. Or you can actually also put AngularRect % code in.
Where can we see the source of that control that you do, or like how to build a control?
How to build a control, okay. So I'm going to tell you at the end, there's a couple resources that you can look at today. There's actually a great SDK sample. Our goal with ASP Plus also is basically all of our controls, we're not necessarily going to open source, we're still evaluating open source, but we definitely will make the source code freely available. So whether or not you can actually take the source, modify it, send us back the updates, and we incorporate it in the product. We're not quite as sold with that. But definitely you'll be able to download the source for all of our controls and for a large part of the product and play with it as you will. So it'll be a great way to sort of figure out how we build stuff.
Question.
Yeah.
I've read that the data set is like a disconnected record set, essentially. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so the question is, the data set, which is the API we're using right here, is to some extent disconnected record set, or it has a disconnected quality to it. And basically, the reason it does is you can sort of download multiple tables into a data set, send them off, and go ahead and party on them, and the data set will encapsulate the changes necessary to reflect those back into the original data source. That's sort of high level what I know.
It's both, it's bound and it's disconnected.
Yeah, so it can actually be, it does make it possible to sort of flow sort of data between tiers or between apps, and then apply changes back. We're seeing a little bit later with web services where you can really extend data sets to publish, data from within your app in a neat way. So we'll see it download just a little bit. What I want to show really quickly here is a common problem I mentioned in the beginning, which is validation, which every big web app uses validation. You'll notice this text box right now, I didn't put any values in it because I was lazy. And as a result, I'm still doing operations, but hey, what if I actually want to force the guy to actually enter something in before I do something? And I want to have an error message, and I only want to execute my code if they fill those values in. I could write a lot of custom code to handle that. But one nice thing with ASP Plus is we have a built-in validation architecture. One customer there. Basically, the way our validation architecture works is we have a set of what we call validation controls, and we ship about 6 in the product. Required field validation, which means you got to fill something in. A range validation, which means it's got to be within a specific range. A compare validation, which means you can compare 2 controls together. For example, password, confirm password. A regular expression validator, which allows you to put any arbitrary regular expression. A custom validator, which lets you put any custom script or server code, client-side code validated. We also have what we call validation summary, which basically groups all the validation errors on the page and displays them in a single list. The validation architecture is pluggable. So we already have a third party that's already built a zip code and a phone validator that basically will look and say, is this a valid zip code? And go off to a database and double check it. So how does the validation architecture work? Well, basically you drop the validation control in the place on the page that you want an error message to show up. There's a control to validate property. You point at the control you want to validate. Because we have different validators, they each have an object model which reflects the actual type of thing you're trying to do. Then you can either have an error message as an attribute or basically the inline content for the tag, and that's what will show up if validation fails. So for example, you must enter your name. It's going to show up in that portion of the page if I don't enter my name value. Enter it, and it will work. So what I'm going to do right here is basically show 2 validators.
How did you know not to render?
How did you know not to render in that case? So I'm going to get to that in just a second. So I'm going to drop one other validator, which is going to validate, same validator, but this time it's actually going to validate a drop-down list control. So the nice thing about extracting out the validators into a separate control is, 1, you can have type-specific validators. 2, your actual control vendor don't have to re-implement validation logic all over the place. And 3, it means that you actually, as a page developer, get to control where the error messages show up. So if you have a table and you want to have all the values on the left-hand side of the line and all the error messages aligned, you have to actually have a column between the two to actually make that happen. By separating out the validation from the control, you have the ability to do that. What I'm going to do right here is I just dropped another required field validator on there. This time it's actually going to go against this drop-down text box and complain if I don't change the value from the initial value, which is the select category. The question that someone raised was, well, how do I actually prevent code from executing if something isn't valid? So there's a couple ways you could do that. This is a control, so you can give it an ID, and you can actually talk to that control and say, if it made the ID equals foo, you could say foo.is valid, and it'll tell you whether or not the control that it's validating is valid or not. The other thing you can do from a page developer standpoint is we actually bubble up the overall validation status of the page to the page object. And so you can actually, from the page object, say, if everything on the page is true, then do something. And that will tell you whether all validators on the page are correct or not, whether or not, before you actually go ahead and execute some code. And one thing you'll notice here, let's actually start at the beginning here. You'll notice when I select here, I'm not actually doing a post back before that error message is showing up. As I fill things in on the client, these error messages are actually disappearing. The reason we're doing this is because the validators are doing automatic up-level validation on the client. You can optionally say always do down-level, but it's automatically doing up-level validation, which means you don't have to write the HTML, you don't have to write the JavaScript to do it. Now you're asking, well, what happens if I hit it with Netscape? Well, with Netscape, we automatically do down-level validation. So I do have to round trip back to the page, but the validation will occur on the server, which means A, I don't have to worry about what the browser capabilities are, and B, it also means because we're always validating on the server, you don't have to worry about spoofing, where the guy actually bypasses the client-side script and actually gets in on the server. Other neat thing for IE customers is there's a large band of customers that actually don't support JavaScript. Like if you go to like a Department of Defense machine at Pentagon, they might have actually said, oh, you can't support JavaScript. I did this once in a demo and I couldn't figure out how to turn it back on. Complete disaster. But say I hit this page here and I go, you'll notice that even though I'm heading with IE, we are still doing down-level validation. I do have to do round trips, but it does mean that as a result, validation still works, my app still functions.
And the view source now looks different, or
the view source will actually look the same for both up-level and down-level.
okay?
What basically happens is, and we will still admit that the client-side JavaScript library can cause the up-level validation.
Okay.
What's happening is, the way we've admitted it, the browser will just gracefully fail if it doesn't support script.
You have multiple validators on one control.
Yeah, so that's another benefit of stripping out, is you can actually have multiple validators on one control. So you have a required field validator and a range validator pointing at the same guy. Or two regular expressions pointing at the same guy. Yep.
Can those validators be culture specific?
Can they be culture specific? Yes. Good testing point to make sure that we've actually, for the up-level stuff, but something for down-level.
Zip code, for example.
Yes, absolutely. Both in terms of like date, time, and number formats, but also in terms of, can you have zip codes that actually, we don't ship the zip codes ourselves, but absolutely the zip codes could automatically determine the culture of the page and go based on that. So one last thing I want to show here, before I go to a bigger sample, is I talked at the beginning about code content separation and code cleanup. The nice thing about what I've shown you so far is the amount of code that you wrote was pretty small, the UI was particularly custom, and it was logically separated into a separate part of the overall file. Right? So it wasn't intermixed into the HTML, but it was still inside the ASPX file. So what happens if you actually want to rip all code and say, I don't even want the people designing my pages to even be able to touch my code? Well, we have an option. So you can actually remove all code references from the file altogether. And then basically all you need to do at the top is point to a precompiled class, or you can point to a source file where we'll dynamically compile it on the fly. Ooh, no, not that good. So this is the exact same code, now put inside a class, so it looks more like a code file. The page works identically the same, but now when I go back to that ASPX file, you'll notice the code that I had in there before is completely isolated. which means I can pass this off to a designer. I can go ahead and localize it for across any languages, and I don't have to worry about third parties sort of stomping on my source code.
Furthermore, with your designers, if you didn't want them to have to ramp up to the ASP namespace controls,
They can absolutely use the
you just
HTML.
teach them a few things, run it server.
Exactly. So all you do is you take the input type equals text, run it equals server.
Right.
Yeah, question?
Are you building a tree model for the page or the streaming model?
Tree model.
So when you do that data binding, at some point on the server, if it's a very large data set, the entire table will exist on the server.
So the question is, yeah, so if you have a very large data set for something like data list or a templatized thing, right now we do actually, we don't flyweight. Now having said that, what we are looking at doing for data grid is actually flyweight if you have a non-templatized version, specifically to make that same super fast. So we have the ability to flyweight. Right now our implementation is done.
Can the data grid paginate?
Yes, the data grid can paginate.
So it can paginate across, posting to get each page.
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
You mentioned at some point that if we can access the value of a element by putting an element, the name of the element dot and value to access it.
Yep.
Do we have now a object model on the server that mimics the HTML object model on the client?
So the question is, do we have an object model now on the server that can mimic the HTML object model on the client? And the answer is kind of. If you actually use, say, for example, the HTML tags, like if you say span run it equals server, to some extent you do have an object model on the server that mimics the HTML on the client. It's to some extent a subset, though. Like you can't sync an on blur event because we don't know that on the server. But for example, manipulating the style collection, manipulating the inner HTML, the inner text property of those controls. Yeah, we try to be consistent. We don't want to introduce a completely new object model for those tags that do that already exist. Now, what I want to show here is so we have sort of a very simple walkthrough that we walk through the code. What I want to show is a slightly more complicated app. That sort of follows on some of the things we built. We call it sort of grocer to go. Which if you say really fast sounds like grocer to go. Unfortunately we didn't figure out until we started saying that on stage. But basically, it's not really an e-commerce app, but it actually is kind of a somewhat slick UI. The thing I want to highlight basically is we built this using all the controls that you saw in that walkthrough. There's no extra controls that we're using. So for example, right here, drop down, button, text box, another button. Here's that data list. Difference here is we're setting the column width to be 4, horizontal flow. The previous one we had 2. In addition to having an item template, the data list actually has a selected item template. And so what's happening is it's maintaining its own selection mode, and it just actually toggles the item that's currently selected into selected item mode when that guy's selected. Here's that data list again using a second template, that second template that we supply. Here's an image control. Here's another data list right here that's actually where each one of those guys is, and that's just sort of a server control within a template, is the item, header, and footer.
Question.
Yeah.
Selected mode. There must be some type of persistence there. Client side, server side?
So it's server side. So basically the server side, there's a selected item template you define.
So in a multi-box deployment.
Sorry, no. So to be clear, we're not storing any state at all on the server for this app.
But you are going server.
But we are going back to the server every time you change the selection right now.
Do you have a hidden field there?
So there's a hidden field that actually maintains what's the currently selected item.
Do you have a whole data set for the shopping cart?
We're actually right now storing the shopping cart information by the database.
You're passing a cookie.
Yeah. So we have like a key into the product. Now the thing that's kind of interesting is how much code do you think we wrote to do this? Open-ended question. Any questions? 300 lines. Okay. I got one. 28. Close. But you're also close too. It was 600 lines in ASP. Basically, here's the code. So we have a page load event. We have a category list select event, a product list select event. That's for the drop down and for that data list. Add button click, recount button click, clear cart click. update products. So I'm not counting this as a line of code. That's not as many units. But and I'm not counting comments. But so maybe it's more like 40. But it's pretty clean. The HTML has no code in it. So as a result, you can actually pass this off to localization. And
you could have just ripped those apart.
You could rip those apart, absolutely. Now, one downside that people have identified is, so you are going back to the server, which is not a problem since you're doing very database-intensive stuff. You do actually have to go back to the server for this thing. The downside, though, right now is there's this refresh. I got to refresh, the whole page refreshes, I lose my scrolling position. So that's true for our beta 1 bits. One of the things we've done recently, though, is I haven't checked this in yet, and it's got a few bugs, so bear with me. But basically, though, we have this thing we call sort of the delta model, where the same code, the exact same code the user writes. The difference, though, is we now can actually incrementally repaint the page. So only the dirty regions of the page actually get updated when you round trip. Look, that guy doesn't get updated.
So you're going back to the server to get fragments, and then
we go back to the server to get fragments, and return an XML datagram that actually represents all the dirty regions, and then we incrementally repaint those regions on the page. The benefit is you don't have to write any server-side code. If you have client-side JavaScript disabled, it will work down level. It'll repaint, it'll work. Hit it with Netscape, it'll work as well.
So if you write client-side script, just like normal HTML code, are you going to start getting codes by this?
The one thing with the Delta model, and so it will be a toggle switch you got to turn on, is that you do need to be aware, like, when you do Postback, say you have a Java applet right in the middle of your page. Depending on what it does and what your code does with it on the client, you could run into weird issues. So it is a switch you can turn on or off.
But you encourage people to write all their code server-side, and then you'll run.
If you do that, then absolutely it will just work.
You're doing this postback without changing the implementation of the stage at all, a little bit?
You don't change the user implementation of the page doesn't change at all.
So the postback is hidden in the compiler in control?
Yes. Yeah. And the control implementation, most controls was like 5 lines of control code that enable the Delta stuff. And I have a little bit of other code in the page object which wraps it up. So it ends up, even for control vendors, it's not hard to do. Yeah?
I saw the code, the 28 line of code. They don't include classes. They're still in C#,
yes,
but they want to have within classes. You provide this class yourself later?
Yes, okay, so that's a good point. So the lines of code I showed for this guy, I did actually, in all fairness, I did actually, the database code, this is sort of repetitive, I actually do have a helper class that is actually going to the database. I was just talking about UI code is only...
But that would not put that you provide it to a C# compiler and compile.
Oh, it would. Yeah, you pass it to a C# compiler and it'll compile. Now, if you have a script run equals server block, it won't. But if you do that code behind method that I showed, where you pull it out into a separate file, that'll absolutely compile with the C# compiler. And there we go. So that's sort of UI. So let's. So that's how we build pages. How do you actually expose XML web services? So we think this fundamentally important. People want to build UI in their apps. They also want to expose XML web services. And so our goal is basically to make it super easy to do that. We actually come up with a new resource file, an extension called .asmx, which doesn't stand for anything.
That's the server method.
It was actually originally ASP files. And first executive didn't go well on that. But anyway. Basically it's a way you can write server classes. There is sort of an object-oriented paradigm to it that can basically consume and expose XML services. We automatically do the marshalling and the network access to go ahead and take a schema, convert it into a class, and take a class and convert it into a schema. So the end user model, the end user doesn't have to worry at all about DOMs, net classes, or network I/O, or anything like that. They actually have a very clean programming model that it can work against. Key thing is that any device can go ahead and call an ASP Plus web service. ASP Plus can go ahead and call any other service. So whether it's Linux box, whether it's a Perl script, who cares? They can go ahead and use it and both consume and expose it. XML wire formats will basically enable interoperability. A key thing is this is not object promoted. So what I'm going to be showing you here is it looks kind of like an object decom-like thing to some extent. But that's not really what we're doing. We're not trying to do identity. It's a stateless model. And fundamentally, we want to have a model so that we can actually consume any XML schema that's written, whether or not it defines an object, or what we think is more likely, things like Amazon are going to expose sort of an ordered document, which is really an XML document that isn't structured like an object, but is structured like a purchase order. So how do we do that? Well, basically what we do, so I'm going to create in the right directory, file I'm going to call research.asmx. Top here I'm going to say it's a web service. We wrote the last page in VB, so let's do this in C#. And I'm basically going to say the class that I'm going to expose as a web service is going to be called research. C#, so I'm basically going to go ahead and import 2 namespaces. And then I'm going to go ahead and write that class. And I've seen a lot of people use this on a day-to-day basis, so I'm going to try to make money. Return num1 plus num2. Going to expose a web service that adds 2 numbers and returns the results. Not incredibly compelling.
When do you IPO?
Yeah. Do I have a public offering for you? What I'm going to go ahead and do, though, is so I just basically define a whole bunch of public methods. And when I want to make these things what I call web callable, I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of this new thing we call attributes, which allow me to basically mark things that we can actually introspect at runtime. I'm going to mark it with a web method attribute, which basically says, make this method web callable. And so what ASP Plus will do is when you try hitting this URL, we're going to dynamically compile it and say, look, what are the web callable methods? And for each one, we're going to go ahead and enable it to be called. So what does that look like? Well, we hit this with a browser to begin with. We're going to dynamically compile this guy, and we're going to generate what we call an HTML contract that describes what methods are available within this web service. Right now, it's just that add method. And we have a little bit of HTML that I sort of described what it looks like. This is just the one that comes built in. Obviously, you can customize this and replace this with your own branding. In addition, with an HTML contract, though, we're actually going to automatically generate what we call an SEL contract. This is basically, you can think of it as sort of XML IDEL or something. Not really that, actually. It's basically an XML schema that defines the exact inputs and outputs for SOAP and any other XML schema that you want to support for how you invoke and get a response out of this web method. And this will actually list all of the web methods that are available within that service. Key thing is, I don't have to write a tool or anything to make this available. All I do have to do is hit it with the browser in order to dynamically generate it. So I want to go ahead and double the value of my guy, assuming I get the funding. Obviously, the schemas are automatically outdated. Now, to invoke this thing, I can do one of 2 things. Because I have that strongly, that SEL contract, I can go ahead and take that, and in VS, or also a command line tool that we ship, will dynamically generate a .NET proxy class that will go ahead and invoke it. And that proxy class will be basically research proxy, and it will have a .add method and a .subtract method. It will have both synchronous as well as asynchronous methods in order to invoke it. When I call that method, I'm just going to pass 2 in, so I'm going to expect an int back. But basically, the proxy that we generate will automatically marshal those arguments up into XML, and then use our the system.net classes to go ahead and invoke that remote service. When we get the response, they'll automatically unmarshal it and return the values to me. Our proxy tool will generate source code, so you can always go in and actually tweak what happens. But out of the box, you can just go ahead and call it. Now, I'm lazy and I don't have time, so what I'm just going to do is go ahead and basically take advantage of this little HTML debugger that we have and go ahead and invoke it directly. So in this case, I just typed in 2 values, hit invoke, goes ahead, accesses the thing, and returns back the XML payload that handles the response. So this is kind of boring. I can't type. So what I really want to do to make this liven this up, let's go do some database access. So rather than add two numbers, let's go ahead. We're going to import the system.data. System.data SQL namespace. Then basically I'm going to have this get products method. It's going to go off to the same database we're using in the previous samples. But instead of binding the resulting data to UI, I'm going to go ahead and just return this data set. Let's go back. Go to get products, category 2. And what it's going to go ahead and do is return the database values, complete with a schema that actually describes what each of those values actually represent in terms of types and various information.
Question?
Yeah?
How do you control the processing instruction in order to put encoding with the FCC, for example?
How do you actually program within the data set itself?
When it says XML version 1.0 for Asian languages, you're going to need encoding it once UTF-16.
That would be a bug. Yeah. We actually do in ASP Plus. We have a way you can actually control for your page or for the app the actual default encoding sequence. And so right now we're not actually picking that up and spitting it out. So thank you for pointing that out. We'll fix that. So this is kind of somewhat interesting. The good news here is it means you have a very simple way you can basically now flow data out of your app. Obviously you can apply an XSLT template to go ahead and transform the schema into whatever data type you want. Now the downside is though, say for example I don't want to really work with data sets. Data sets are kind of like record sets in ADO. They're much richer. But fundamentally, they're someone else's objects. Say, for example, instead I want to actually define my own classes and pass them around. How do I go ahead and do that? Well, the good news is it's actually pretty easy to do. So what I'm going to go ahead and do here now is define an order object. Inside this file, or I could obviously put it into another file. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one more method to my file called getOrder. Let's just nuke that for clarity. And all this getOrder guy is going to do is it's going to basically instantiate the order object, set some properties on it, and return the object itself. Now I haven't done anything to that object. All I've defined it as sort of like a struct there. Go back to the page, refresh. There's my order object. Go ahead and type in some numbers, invoke it. What you're going to notice right here is we basically automatically serialize that class out to XML using a default serializer. And so just by defining that class with some public fields and properties, we're automatically splatting it out as XML. And likewise, with our proxy tool, we could automatically consume that and then create an instance on the other side. Or if I'm talking to a full script, it could just treat it as an XML document, and away you go. Now, one downside, or one thing I should point out is that we don't expect, we expect there to be a variety of different XML schemas out there on the web for the next couple of years. We don't expect there to be like one standard schema that everyone follows, which means that as a developer, you need to be able to morph your objects to conform to existing schemas. And likewise, I think you want to have the complete flexibility so that you can define your own schema that you want to actually publish as a document, not as a class. And then you can go ahead with your code and consume and expose it. So what we've actually done with ASP Plus is basically allowed you, just like you say web method, you can actually decorate your class optionally if you don't like our built-in schema that we actually output. Basically transform it, so for example, instead of treating that thing as an element, I can make it an attribute. We do serialize complete object graphs, so if you have an array of objects, you can go ahead and, obviously construct that. Say I don't want to call it order ID, but I want to call it research ID. Obviously, I could go ahead and control that. So what it means is basically I can exactly mimic any XML schema out there, and at the same time program with a rich object model without having to do any kind of my own XML manipulations. I should point out we do have a tool that if you do have an existing XSD compliant schema, you can actually run it to the tool and it will dynamically generate a class with the appropriate XML metadata markup. So it will automatically, so if you have an Amazon schema, run it through the tool, and it will generate a whole bunch of Amazon classes that you can then program against. Declare them within your web method, and away you go. You don't have to do anything more to parse it, to validate it, etc.
Can you automatically do instance data typing?
I believe so, yes.
So it could give you the answer to sprint that. Not on the attribute, of course.
I believe so, yes. But we talk afterwards, and we can try to walk through the code. Yep.
I noticed that you use SQL connection instead of ADO. Do you see any reason to still use ADO if you know that you are using only SQL?
So the question was, do you see any reason to use ADO? So ADO Plus basically has a notion of what we call providers. And providers talk directly to specific data. So unlike OLED, where you sort of have to implement lots of interfaces to be a provider, it's not possible for a provider to basically push either a data reader or a data set. So it becomes a lot easier to basically write a provider. And it means also that providers can be sort of very host-specific. So you have a secret provider that has a very SQL API, Oracle provider with an Oracle API, an XML provider with an XML API. Now, so ADO Plus comes with 3 providers in the box. I could be wrong, but I know there's at least 3. The ADO provider, which works against any OLED data source, the SQL provider that works against any SQL data source, and an XML provider that works against XML text files. We found in tests the SQL provider to be about 2 to 3x faster than ADO Classic when running an ASP Plus and when doing a loop versus ASP and ADO. But we haven't done right now any extensive performance tests against the ADO. And my guess is that they're going to really tune fast. So if you know you're always going in SQL, I'd recommend using the SQL provider. Yeah.
Question. What does a consumer of this particular service needs? For example, a DLL or an EXE on the other side is consuming it. What does it need?
Okay, what does something on the other side need? So basically, all the thing the other side needs is, the other side doesn't need anything. It needs basically, at its most primitive, it needs some network API to go ahead and invoke a neural. So it can be a Perl script on a Linux box, goes ahead, uses the Perl APIs to invoke the thing over the network, get back some text, use regular expressions to parse it.
How is it getting the type system? For example, you are exposing the order file. How exactly is it getting the type system back?
The beauty of basically, so the question is how do you get the type system back? The beauty of basically exposing XML schemas is that although on a .NET framework platform, you might want to have a type that you get back. On another platform, you might actually just want to treat this thing as an XML text file. Actually as an XML document, where instead of getting a type, you're just going to custom parse it. See, the beauty of treating it either as a type or not even treating it as a type. So we're going to have an automatic type converter, type generator that'll basically take that STL contract and generate a .NET type. I think Don Box with Developmentor has actually written a Java one, where they'll actually take an STL contract and generate a Java proxy.
So can they extend them also? For example, your order object, can they extend it? For example, they want to add a couple of methods on it, the consumer?
They could, yeah. So our proxies always generate source. So you can definitely either tweak the network API, the network code that our proxy generates, and you can also add helper methods that don't necessarily go back to the server, but are useful. So yeah, you can definitely tweak the API. Yeah.
So everything you've done today has been hacking HTML or some part thereof. Is there any plans for a GUI to build something that just builds it visually?
Okay. So everything I've done so far is in Notepad. The question is, what about a GUI? So basically, VS7 is about building web apps. So let's go to VS7. So VS7, in terms of the beta quality right now, I think is further behind than the SDK. So. You know, so the name of my project is Hope This Works, optimistically entitled. Basically what I'm going to do is load a project. You have the toolbox inside VS. You drag and drop any of those controls onto the page. format. Let's go ahead and change the look and feel of this guy. Double click on the button. I have some code there. Here's some problems right now with alignment PS. Set a breakpoint. Inside my solution, I actually have a page. You'll notice that they do use the code behind method always. So it is possible to always separate those out. Goes ahead, it's attaching the debugger. Got my little calendar. Type my name in here. Hit enter. Have a breakpoint now, so we're basically breaking in there. Full stack watch window, full call stack. Key thing is the VS debugger for HP Plus is cross language. Well, actually for everything, I can't say. But so you can actually debug from VB code into C# code into C++ code. Let's go ahead and step into that business object. When it completes, we're going to data bind it. Go back to my HTML, and there's the result. So yes.
How about remote service?
Oh, come on. Yeah, it'll eventually work. There's actually a bug with this build. Well,
Ship timeframes for ASP Plus in .NET?
So right now, we're targeting a May RTM next year. So that's our current plan.
I'm sorry, say it again? May?
May, right now. So one thing I'll just show really quickly, to make up for my lack of showing the, they also kind of have some property problems, ignore that. But one nice thing that it does also now have is statement completion. It does have, but we won't show that.
How close is this build to like the beta that's supposed to go out?
So VS has come along a lot since this build. This is basically I'm showing the pre-release build that's publicly available now in MSDN.
This is the PDC build?
This is the PDC build, yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about that. We're just going to quickly blitz through, talk about deployment. I talked at the beginning there about no-nonsense deployment. We basically have a model, copy your bits onto the server, and away you go. That means for code, we have a bin directory immediately underneath the app root. Copy any assembly or DLL into there, and it's automatically registered for that application. There is no more registered 32 process required. It also means if you have an app that has an order component, and you have another app that's sort of malicious app sitting next to it, and it tries to create the order component, it'll fail. Because that code is only registered for the app in which it's actually installed into. You can actually register the order component at the system level, but by default we're recommending, hey, just copy your components into your app. And that way you don't have to worry about, say, app posting scenarios. You know, some guy calling, order.place order a couple times and sort of embedding your app. Other key thing is because we now actually have sort of the component isolation at the app level, it means you can actually have version 1 and version 2 of your app running side by side on the same box. And you can just flip the URL as to which is the current active app. You don't have to worry about, so if you want to go live with an app and you realize, like, oh my god, we have so many problems, let's roll back. Just change the URL and away you go. You don't need to worry about, uninstalling the old stuff, installing the new stuff, and configuring everything. To delete something, you don't uninstall it, just delete it. There is no registry queue, there is no magic stuff that's doing in the background, just delete it from the file system. As I mentioned with dynamic code update, you want to update running code that's in a production environment, we have no more locked DLLs inside the bin directory. Just copy a new assembly or new DLL on top of the old one, and away you go. We'll automatically detect the file change notification, spin up a new app instance within the same process, direct all new requests to it, drain all requests from the old app, and then destroy the old app. You don't need to stop the server. There's no tools, there's no utilities, there's no configuration changes. It just works. Group configuration. We now have an XML configuration system, which means that you can actually now copy configuration metadata with the application when you install it. You no longer need to sort of copy the bits, register the bits, and then go to an admin tool and sort of muck with the metadata to try to copy the things in IIS. It's been specifically designed to be hierarchical, so you can actually set things at a global app or machine or site level, lock it down, and then inherit them to the app. And within the app, things that are not locked down, settings can be overridden. Which means that you don't end up having a huge amount of configuration data you have to set, only things that you want to change from the defaults. Developers can write their own session handlers within the config file, which means that we have a really nice mechanism where things like ASP handlers, which is built into ASP+, people can easily configure. But if, say, I want to write my own custom ad server, I can go ahead and actually define an XML schema that actually represents my ad server information and stick it within that config file as well. Anytime the config file changes, we automatically detect that, reset the configuration for the app, and away you go. So you don't actually, if you want to store your own configuration there, you don't have to worry about change notifications at all. Quick example. Kind of like a cheating sample because it actually gets to show off another feature. But so I'm going to show a little. One of the common features we've had from our session state architecture is this notion we call cookieless sessions, which is we always store our session state today on the server, but we actually do use an HTTP cookie to actually keep track of the session ID of the current client. So as a result, when I go cookieless here, click a page, type in my name, go to another page, storing my value, but if I turn off my cookies, this page is going to fail because all of the state is being stored on the server. I have a session ID that's being sent as an HTTP cookie. So the only thing I can do, though, is go to my little config file, and set session state section, set cookieless equal true. Now when I hit that file, what it's going to do is, instead of using a cookie to keep track of the session, it's going to automatically embed inside the URL the session ID, which means if the guy has the cookies disabled, that's okay. The session ID will be automatically pulled out of the Munch URL and maintained.
But large-scale sites don't use sessions on the server.
We'll get to that in a minute. But you're right, yes. This doesn't solve web forms. This basically just solves, I think Germany has what they like a legal use cookies or something.
Right.
Okay.
And so, now you don't go to jail in Germany. That's a good point. So, large sites don't use session state. One of the reasons why is, two reasons why. One is, when a worker process crashes, your session state's lost, which means the app looks less reliable. And two, it doesn't scale across a web farm. Good news with ASP+, we've solved both those issues. We now allow you to store your session state external from a worker process, and we also now allow you to store your session state external from a machine, which means you can now have a cluster of front-end web machine go against state servers in the back end. Those state servers can either use what we call an ASP state service, which is our built-in session state store, or they can go against SQL Server to actually store the data. If you want to have fault tolerance, you can use SQL to Wolfpack cluster the state. The end result means is you can actually blow up a front-end web machine, front-end web server, and your state is not lost. It's only lost if you have a catastrophic failure in your state servers, which is still possible, but it's a little less secure. So how do you do that? So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to go to this other sample here. Reset it. What I basically have is a page called session state. Enter in my name. Sort my name in a session state, goes to another page and spits it out. Now the downside is with this, I'm storing in proc, which is still the default, just like ASP. Downside is though, I go along and kill the ASP+ worker process, which is not a very nice thing to do, but it happens. My session state is going to be lost. I create a new process, my state's been lost. How do I fix that? Well, if I want to go ahead and enable session state to be stored externally or on a remote machine, I do two things. Step one is I actually start up the ASP+ state store. And start ASP state on a machine that I want to actually have the session state store. Once it's started, I go to that app. And inside that app, I basically say, don't use improc. Go against this server, which is in this case is localhost. Hit save. Ooh, I hit save. Hit save again. Now I go ahead, hit Fred. Now instead of storing the state internally, it's storing in a remote state store, or in this case local. The benefit though is, say I go ahead and kill that worker process again. We're going to respin up a new worker process, so those process ID changes, but your state is maintained. That means if your worker process crashes, or the front-end machine goes down, your session state is preserved. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you can now store everything in session state. What it does mean is you have a reliable way to use session state. We still recommend, be clever and only use session state when absolutely necessary. Caching. So one of the things in terms of performance, I quoted those numbers at the beginning of the ASP, the MSN homepage. Key thing is we were not using any caching on that page. We were just actually doing sort of a straight port. It wasn't entirely straightforward. We did an early bound straight port. So we actually changed the late bound script to be really tight-based. So, but we didn't actually fundamentally take advantage of any additional new features with an ASP Plus to really try to make that thing scale. And so one of the things that we sort of identified at the beginning of the project was, well, the best way to do something quickly is not to do it. Which basically translates into, can you reuse the work that you did once before to process a new request? And if you do that, you're going to dramatically cut down the amount of time it takes to process a new request. What we've done with ASP Plus is basically come up with what we call our caching engine, or caching architecture, which allows you to reuse past work on the server, store it on the server, and then use it across multiple new requests that come in. And basically this falls into three buckets that we allow you to do that. The first is what we call an output cache. The output cache basically allows me to store the response from a page request or a web service request on the server, effectively like a proxy server. So when another request hits the same URL with the same query string or post values, it'll go ahead and rather than execute dynamically on the server, it'll just immediately spit back the result. The end result can easily be about a 15x performance improvement. So how do we go ahead and do that? So I showed you. This is demonstrate how we can go ahead and very simply introduce this. I have what we call a cache test sample. It's really simple. Basically all it does is it just spits out the current time. The time is now blocked. This is always dynamic, which means every time you hit it on the server, it's going ahead and re-executing. It's not very expensive, but imagine it was going into a database that I wanted to actually cache this value across multiple requests. So we have a programmatic API that can go ahead and set the cache and validation, or we also have what we call an output cache directive. What this is basically going to say is cache this guy on the server for about a 10-second interval, between 9 and 11, depending on server load and stuff. What this means is every time I hit this from any client, it's going to go ahead and dish back the same result without having to execute any code. So if I have an expensive database query, instead of executing every time the page gets hit, it only gets executed once every 10 seconds.
It's taking consideration only the URL. What about cookies?
So basically, by default, we only vary based on URL. However, you can also set additional properties, so you can automatically vary based on user language, cookies, headers, etc. Some of that will only be available in beta 2. Right now, the only attribute that we set declaratively is duration, but programmatically you can control what we use today.
Is the cache cross front-end IIS boxes?
The question is the cache across front-end web IIS boxes? The answer is no. We actually, each box will end up having its own cache. We're kind of just doing sort of cache coherency, which is pretty complicated. So we are actually looking at doing a back-end cache, not for V1. So that is something we're looking at doing.
So is the cache lookup based on the URL, or is there some?
The cache is based on the URL, but it's a combination of many factors. So you can do user language, the Netscape or IE version, if you want to vary based on user agent, things like that. So an example of how this can basically be used, we have a sample app we call iBuySpy. It's available at www.ibuyspy.com. It's running data return. And basically it's an e-commerce spy app for you can buy spy equipment. If you want to go ahead and get the Mustaf translator, and you can go ahead and it's a real e-commerce app. We sort of designed it to try to perform as well as possible. It uses stored box. It's a really good design, I think. And obviously for each page, and this is true with the online running version, you can pull up the server code that sort of describes, how you designed it, what the performance notes were. Well, then step through the code, it's color-coded, so you can actually figure out what's the server controls and stuff. And then go actually from the page to the business object, and then obviously to the stored product. So if you actually want to see sort of exactly how the overall request flow works, you can do it. And the neat thing is I want to basically highlight within this app 2 pages where we're taking advantage of output caching. One is this page, which is the product details page. The reality is we don't actually need to update this. It is all database driven, but we don't want to hit it on each database request. In fact, we only want to update it when a new review is added. So by just simply saying, output cache this sucker, our perf on this page will jump to about 1,200 pages per second. On a multi-proc box. I don't know if that's 2 or 4 CPUs. But it's a pretty dramatic, it's about a 10x or 8 or 9x perf jump just by adding that one line. Also, this category drop down here is basically caching 7 different instances of that page on the server, and then we just automatically dish out the appropriate cached instance depending on what query string argument is being passed in. But the end result is if you have, sort of e-commerce front-end, product catalog page, this is a great example of how you can go ahead and cache it for maximum use. So in addition to output caching, which is useful for entire pages, one of the things we realized really worked very quickly was that if you have highly personalized sites, you really can't cache the entire page because you want to say, "Hi Scott, welcome to iBuySpy." But at the same time, there's regions of that page, like the menu on the bottom left-hand side, where you really do want to cache the output. So that's why we came out with what we call fragment caching. Now this isn't checked in for beta 1, but basically it's going to allow you to incrementally select regions of the page that you actually want to output cache. So the page is still dynamic, you still have the code executing, but there's regions of the page that, if possible, will be served directly out of the cache. The end result is it's not as fast as output caching, but if you have, say, 2 or 3 database queries on a page, and you can encapsulate those within cache regions, you can dramatically improve performance. And when you look at most common web pages today on high-performance e-commerce sites, large parts of each page can actually be cached. Then for those cases where you don't actually want to do output caching of UI or services, but rather you actually want to cache data, we do have a generic cache API. Looks like a dictionary. Difference, though, is it actually enables you to do timer or file change-based invalidations. We will have a way that you can do trigger-based invalidations for when SQL data changes, but you have to write a little code to do that. But out of the box, we do support both timer and file change invalidations. The advantage there is you can then go to a database, get a data set, stick it in the cache, and then your code just check from the cache first. If it's not in the cache, go get it from the database and stick it back in the cache. In addition to sort of timer and file-based validations, we also watch the memory load of the system. So if your memory starts filling up, we'll automatically start evicting things from the cache using the LRU algorithm. Security. So out of the box, we basically support 5 built-in modes of authentication. Basic Digest and NTLM are actually right now supported directly from IIS today. We just basically wrap those. For ASP Plus, though, we're introducing 2 additional modes of authentication. One is Passport, which basically allows you to use Passport as the sort of central credential validation provider. In addition, we're providing what we call a custom forms-based authentication story. This like Passport, uses a cookie-based scheme. But unlike Passport, instead of going off to the Passport site to do credential validation, it basically allows you to provide a login page within your app. And then you basically tell us, whenever someone tries to hit a secure resource, we direct them to the login page. It allows the user to actually go ahead and customize what that UI looks like. So they can actually have their own little branding and say, enter your username, password, have a button to register. And then basically, the end user, the developer goes ahead and actually tells us whether or not they actually log in successfully or not. If they log in successfully, we do the encryption to generate a encrypted security token ticket that we set as an HTTP cookie down to the client. And then we'll basically automatically allow them access to any resource that they have that's been acted appropriately. So basically, if you're on Amazon or Yahoo or any kind of internet site that does that kind of authentication, this suddenly becomes a real no-brainer in order to build. iBuySpy is a great example of it. Also means that you don't have to actually always validate against the NT-SAM or the NT-DX. It means that you can now actually validate against a database, against a text file, against an XML file. You have complete flexibility over where the usernames and passwords are stored. That's authentication. In terms of authorization, we have a number of neat features. One of which is we no longer only support user-based authorization. Meaning, in addition to saying this user has this access to this page and doesn't have access to that page, you can now actually define higher-level roles within your application that you can then map users into, and then provide per URL authorization for those roles. You can say managers have access to this page, but not APs, or vice versa. And then what it means as a developer, you can actually give it off to an administrator or a site operator, and they can actually map users into those roles, which provides a nice decoupling of the whole development operation side. It means you don't have to bake into your code notion about pre-existing users. And it means for ISVs that want to build enterprise apps, it becomes really cool for them because suddenly they don't have to think about, oh, only Redmond / FooBar users are allowed into this page. Which would bake the app only to Microsoft. They can instead define these higher level roles, and then when Microsoft buys the app, they just add the users into the appropriate roles.
So why is service string based? I see user manager VB strings.
Why is it string based?
Why don't we use something on 0, 1, 2?
It's ultimately a string that we actually do the check on. You can certainly put 0, 1, 2 in quotes. As well. I don't know. There's no particular reason why we made string-based. We can talk afterwards and we figure out the specific scenario that doesn't cover. In addition to doing sort of declarative appling of resources based on roles, the other thing that we actually provide you, and we sort of integrate with sort of MTS and Comp Plus on this, is we basically allow you to, within your code now, you can actually say, well, everyone has access to this page, but when they try to go ahead and, put together that expense report, I'm going to check to say, oh, if they're a peon and the expense report is more than $10,000, throw an exception. So it basically allows you to do very fine-grained control within your code by just calling an API, which is user.isEnroll. You can also obviously call it user.identity.name, which will actually give you the actual username of the person.
Is this using Complex? I mean, where's it getting all these from? Where's it storing?
Where's it getting all the roles from?
Yeah.
So it depends on the authentication mechanism you use. So if you're using NTLM Basic or Digest, it actually gets the roles from the groups on the system. If you're using Passport or, but that's by default. You can actually provide your own custom role-to-user mapping out of the box.
Is this feature working already? Authentication?
Yeah, that actually works. Yeah, that should work. It works for me. But it actually would be a great area if you run the issues or run into features that you'd like. I think that is an area of the product that hasn't been as pounded on by end users as much as some of the other parts. So that'd be great to get your feedback. In addition, so that's authentication authorization. For code execution, we actually also have some extra goodies. One is we do still support per request impersonation like IIS does, which is basically where if I am authorized as Redmond/.goo and ASP and IIS today, we'll actually execute the ASP as Redmond/.goo. We'll use the NT impersonation APIs to do that. It's good for some scenarios, it's awfully bad for others. The downside is from a testing perspective, something means if I actually deploy like a choice app on Microsoft, the reality is there's 36,000 possible people that choice app could actually run under. And it's possible that one or two of them might not have the permissions that the other ones do. And so it can be a real testing nightmare. So what ASP Plus enables you to do is basically say, I'm not going to do per request impersonation, but do instead of app impersonation. I'll still authenticate and authorize users into the app. But once they're in the app, the running code is always going to run as a consistent account. So for example, I could say that 401k or choice app is always going to run as Redmond/choice. And I could actually go ahead and tackle my database servers accordingly. To say, oh, the Redmond choice app has access to this, but Redmond/.goo doesn't. In addition to sort of the impersonation support that we've added, we also have support for what we call code access permission sets. So this is something I talked at the beginning about sandboxing. This is primarily for application server providers, which want to store, say, 10,000 apps on a site. What they can basically do is they can go ahead and sandbox each app at a site level to say, oh, you have access, you can run your code, you can upload your code on here, but you can't touch the file system, and you can't go off onto the network. And then we have the ability to basically wrap permission sets around the code and restrict that access. We have a number of service providers out of the box that are going to go ahead and provide free hosting support for us. The carrot for them is they can then, at a permission set level, turn on permissions. So freebies, you can't access the box and you can't access SQL. Pay an extra $10, you can access the disk. Pay an extra 15, you can go against SQL. And so it gives them a nice model where they can basically upsell features while maintaining sort of a nice secure environment.
Security, if you don't impersonate like that, and you're using integrated security on a database that you normally just pass things through, just use caller, as a caller, who's the caller, you just do it on a piece of basis.
Yeah. So in terms of reliability, almost like the last slide, I have some summary and some links, so I know we're running over. Key thing I just want to point out is ASP Plus is basically been designed with the assumption that failures are going to occur in the system, which is a difference from our previous model with IS and ASP, where we assume that we could fix all the bugs before we ship. Or specifically that all of our users had no bugs. We're basically assuming that you want your app to always be up 24/7. At some point during the 365 days of the year, some problem is going to occur. And so we specifically built ASP Plus to automatically recover from those problems. Having said that, we do intend to fix all the bugs before we ship. So with ASP Plus, we no longer run inside the INET info worker process. We always run out of product. We do have our own process model, though, so we don't use the IS process model. We sort of tweaked our process model quite a bit over the last year. The neat thing about our process model is it automatically detects and recovers from a variety of runtime problems. So the IIS process model today recovers from access violations. We've added memory leak and deadlock detection. So it's now possible to set for the system to say how much memory can the ASP Plus consume on the system, how much virtual memory. By default, 75%. Once you get above that 75% threshold, we'll spin up a new worker process, start sending requests to it, and kill the old worker process. We'll assume that something's gone wrong in the system, it's chewing up too much memory, and automatically restart it. You have a memory leak, which basically we interpret as there's requests going into the app, and they ain't coming out. You can set an upper threshold. You hit that threshold, spin up a new worker process, directly request to it, kill the old one off. The end goal is, likewise for access violation, the end goal is basically you should never have to go and restart the box. Now, once we did that, we actually talked to a lot of customers, and we looked at Apache quite a bit. And they have Apache and a lot of Linux customers have this really neat feature, which is they assume there's memory leaks, and they assume the app's going to crash at least once a week. Turns out a lot of our customers assume the app's going to crash once a week. But the neat thing with Apache is they basically go, well, it's going to crash once a week. Every 4 days, we'll just automatically restart it. Or out of the box, it's like every 30 requests, it's just automatically restarted. And if you laugh, but it actually, the perception of reliability is much, much higher. Because you don't have to worry about memory leaks if you reboot every 30 seconds. So what we've done with ASP Plus is we've kind of borrowed those features, which is we now, in addition to sort of automatic recovery from problems, we do support preemptive cycling of processes. So you can actually tell us every 20 minutes, reboot the worker process. And we do it gracefully. We spin up a new app, make sure it's ready, start sending requests, and then kill off the old one. So it's not like we just terminate process in the middle of a request. You can do that time-based, or you can actually say, like, well, I'm going to set it up so every 5 days it reboots. But it's really not always time-based. Sometimes if there's like 2 million requests, then it does it. So then just set it up, first time either 5 days, or when it gets to the 2 million request point, reboot. The nice thing is you can use those settings, obviously, in combination with these settings. So you can end up setting it so, like, I'm going to automatically recover from all these problems, and then just to sort of eliminate code rot, I'm just going to, under the covers, reboot periodically. End result should be dramatically improved perception of reliability. It is perception, and that's actually really what matters. If administrators and customers don't know the server's rebooting underneath them.
It is reliable. It really is.
It really is reliable, yeah. If a tree falls in the forest and no one's around, you hear it. I have no idea what that means, but anyway. One thing I just want to point is, so we've basically talked about our high-level programming model and a whole bunch of plumbing. Look at the session state. caching, security, blah, blah, blah. The thing we did when we started the project, though, is we said we actually don't want this to be just some giant black box system. We hope that we actually provide a compelling offering out of the box. But at the same time, we don't want to assume that we know everything you want to do. And so what we've done is we've architected ASP Plus so at its lowest level, you can pull out and replace anything you want. Whether it's a control, you can subclass and replace it, or our security system. You can rip it out and replace it. Or you just rip it out and not even replace it. If you want to tune your server, hey, I have no security, just remove security. You don't want session state, remove session state. You want to replace session state, create your own, and just slot it into the system. So everything is pluggable, you can pull things apart, and you can tie it at a very low level to take advantage of the capabilities. And at lowest level, we call the HTTP runtime, which is basically a managed replacement, .NET replacement for our SAPI extensions and filters. Gives you the ability to participate in each request with something we call the HTTP module, so you can actually tie in right before the authentication process to do something. And it also gives you the ability to write what we call HTTP handlers, which are logically replacements for extensions. This host runs on top of any platform. So out of the box, we support IS5, IS4, IS6, we will, as well as a version that runs on top of IE. The version that runs on top of IE is kind of an interesting thing we call a personal tier. It's basically where you can run ASP Plus without a web server, where we actually run in a sandbox inside IE. We've actually recently postponed that feature to V11. It does work with the free PDC bits, but we're working with SQL and Exchange to do some better database offline stuff before we want to release it.
Is it fully capable?
Beg your pardon?
Is it fully capable?
It's fully capable. It's the same code base. The other thing I want to mention is that, so we do run on NT4 as well as Win2K. So we do run on top of IS4 as well as IS5. Other thing I was going to mention is it is actually possible to host ASP Plus from within your own web server or from within your own app. So I just posted to a news group or the discussion list, how to host ASP Plus from an Nexi. I don't know if you necessarily want to, but you could. So it's fully hostable. So we've had customers that said, hey, we want to do some batch jobs and we want to have them be as pages, and how would we do that from an Nexi? It's pluggable so that it can actually sit on top of anything. We thought for fun it would be kind of cool just to spend a weekend and port it onto Apache. None of us have free weekends, but as soon as we do, we're going to do that on Windows, just for kicks. So how does it work? So basically, we have these HTTP modules, which are logical replacement for filters. They can participate on the way into a request and the way out of a request. Handlers go ahead and actually execute each individual request. Along the way, there's an HTTP context object that people can basically stuff things into and replace things out of. Key thing is, an HTTP module, example, session state, output caching, security. They've just been built as modules. There's no built-in APIs. Every page, every .hpx page and every .htmx web service is just an HTTP handler. We just compile down into a class that derives from the page class, which implements the HTTP handler interface. So there's no built-in magic. It's all part of a factored system.
Question.
Yep.
Does it also, can you make it work for other extensions, or it has to be only ASP?
So yes, the question is, can you make it work for other extensions? The answer is absolutely. So you can, so the way, yeah, so you can, so I have a demo I can show you later about a server-side XSL transformer, where you just hit any XML file in the file system, and I try to do an XSL transform on it. And it's like 5 lines of code.
So is it like in the same ISIP deal that you have the event model? After we process one event, you can go into the other event, or each module is separate?
Yeah, so basically, here's the events from a module that you can go ahead and sync. And you can sync any number of them that you want. So things like begin requests, authenticate requests, authorize requests. You can read the list. Those are actually sort of in order how they get executed. And then there's 2 transmission events, pre-send request headers and pre-send request content that you can actually sync. And those can execute out of band. It's basically first time bits are written to the wire, which is not always deterministic. It's either whoever calls responds to flush first, or whenever it gets beyond a certain size and we start streaming. So Visual Studio support we actually already showed, but as I mentioned, BS is betting big on the web and on ASP+. They've broken compatibility with a lot of previous versions of the product, specifically because they want to make sure they're tuned for the web environment. And so they're pretty gung-ho. And as a result, we're going to have a really nice sort of rad IDE tool at the end of the day for basically dragging and dropping the system together to build stuff. A key thing is I've shown you a notepad today. The reason I wanted to show you a notepad was not because I'm a masochist, but basically to show you that the underlying architecture and the underlying platform is simple enough that it should now be easy to build tools. Whether there are tools, or the nice thing with our syntax, you might not notice, is it works in front page today. So front page just ignores run equal server. So you can actually, it's not really an ASP Plus editor, but it won't bark on your page when you try to load it inside front page, even the shipping versions. So our hope is basically ASP Plus really provides a quantum leap in power over what we have today. There's tons of new features and infrastructure. A lot of those are really great end-user features. And like we talked briefly on the ASP runtime, there's a lot of infrastructure support so that advanced developers are going to be able to build infrastructure pieces that end users are going to be able to consume, whether those controls, modules, handlers, you name it. It is part of this broader frameworks effort. I showed you at the beginning those sort of 15 namespaces, sort of core namespaces that we're shipping. Systems.web is the biggest namespace in terms of functionality. But each one of those basically has a really rich fabric that you can delve into, similar to what we have here today. So there's tons of stuff, across the overall framework to play with. As a result, we think we're going to make building distributed web apps a lot easier, a lot less plumbing code, enables a lot better scenarios. And as a result, we're going to see a lot richer apps and make it a lot easier to build things. So in terms of finding out more stuff about ASP Plus, our code name is XSP, which also didn't stand for anything. But basically, there's an XSP discussions alias that you can join. There's some good traffic there. Probably the best way right now is we do have a book out called A Preview of ASP Plus, written by Rox Press. It's available on Amazon.com. We did hit the top 100 a couple weeks ago. We've fallen down to 200. I'm trying to really hype the book because I want to beat Harry Potter. Got to do it. But basically, it's a really good book, about 500 pages. It does a pretty good job of covering the overall platform. It doesn't go deep in a lot of things, but there's certainly enough to get a lot of syntax examples and understand sort of the various things I just talked about today. There's a public application you go out to today called ibyspy.com. There's both a BB and a C# version running side by side at data return. You can step through all the code to learn more about it. There's a whole bunch of community sites out there that are actually dedicated to ASP Plus. And so there's a lot of really good forums out there. ASPNG.com has some really good listservs that are ASP Plus specific. The other one I didn't put up here is developmentor.com, which is Don Box's company. They have a listserv called a .NET list. There's about 1,500 people on it now. And there's actually about 150 mail messages per day on it. And there's a higher signal-to-noise ratio on it than some of the ASP Plus listservs. There's some Sun employees on it, which is always fun. But it's a great way to sort of see a lot of the traffic. The nice thing is people are really jazzed and pretty excited, both the people that went to the BDC and the people afterwards. Other thing I just want to quickly point out is, so the iBuySpy app is a really great end-to-end app that shows how to build sort of an e-commerce app, which is a great way to see how all the pieces fit together. The book sort of describes end-to-end the platform. The other thing we've done is we've built what we call the ASP Plus Quick Starts. And basically this is 400 ASP Plus samples, available all of them in BB and C#. Where basically they're very focused, task-driven things. So if I want to figure out about something a little bit more interesting, how to do a parameterized data grid, I can go ahead and run a sample online, and then view the source code online as well to see exactly how it was written. And you can see it obviously in BB as well as C#.
And that's part of the .NET SDK.
That's part of the .NET SDK. So that's installed with the product. It's also available today. So iBuySpy is running online. If you go to ASPNG.com, also all the quick starts are available online.
Right. You can also get that at MSDN, WAC, net.
Yes. And so you can actually download the SDK itself at msdn.net. Key thing is about the SDK is it doesn't replace anything on your system, so you shouldn't be afraid to necessarily install it. It does require IE55 and Win2K, but it runs side by side with ASP, so it won't nuke your existing ASP installation at all. So if you want to download it and play with it, even on your production, well, not on your production site necessarily, but at least on your development box. There should be no problem with it.
Who owns the code for iBuySpy? Did we author that?
Yeah, so we own the code.
So we have broad source ownership.
Yeah, we don't own the iBuySpy trademark.
Interesting.
Sure. Yeah, so we talked if you have specific, I mean...
Yeah, I do. So we'll
but we basically help very aggressively with the code and subcontract it out for... But basically we own the code.
Was that with Vertigo?
Yeah.
Do you have an internal Microsoft website?
Yes, we do have an internal Microsoft website, which is down right now. It's a hard drive problem, so it's not software. Basically, if you go to URT Frameworks, or if you go to the XSP website, it should redirect you. But right now, the hard drive is down, so we're furiously trying to rebuild it. So go to URT Frameworks, and that'll take you there. So our other code name is URT.
What about all these samples and this PowerPoint presentation? Where do you have it?
Yeah, where are these slides?
Good point. So where you can go to, let me get a nip tab. It's plugged into something. That will give you a share. While I'm doing that, any questions?
So the easiest thing to do is just to install the SDK on any machine we have, and we can play with all the stuff, and we don't need to install VisualStudio.net.
Yeah, that's probably definitely the easiest way to do it. So I'm going to create a share called ScottGU-W2K /slides right now. And then presentation is going to be called ASP plus over. It's got a ominous name, maybe overview.
Begin.
Yeah, begin, yeah. So that's there now, and I think Teresa's going to post the slides internally, but I'm not sure whether she's going to be able to send out a link.
Do you have the samples as well inside the old?
Do I? Sorry, with the...
All the samples that you showed.
So all the walkthrough samples that I showed are available as part of the quick starts. So the first quick start, the ASP Plus Web Forms intro, walks you through the sort of page that we built.
Do you have any HTTP runtime samples?
ASP Plus, sorry, what?
HTTP runtime.
Yes, if you send me mail, I can send you some really cool ones.
Yeah, actually I did, but I never got around.
Oh, okay. Oops, yeah, send it again. My mail service has been down the last couple days, so I'm not getting much mail. Or I'm terribly behind now. It's back up.
The SDK you said, PDC,
Yes, if you go to www.microsoft.com, or sorry, msdn.microsoft.com/net, you can actually download the SDK from Microsoft.
The internal architecture you have, how much unmanaged code you
So with ASP Plus, so in terms of ASP Plus, we're about 95% managed code C#. The only unmanaged code we have basically pertains to our process model. And we don't run any managed code inside info. We're not even going to run the runtime in there. So we basically have a managed like SAPI that calls out by named pipes to our process model. That's all the managed code we really have.
So you don't have ISAPI filter?
Yeah, an ISAPI extension. And then basically, the code base for our stuff. It's just, a pretty clean setup. I'm going to pull up the text box.
Now, someone's using Comp Plus features now. Build runtime managed code as well.
Okay. Yeah. So Compost, like 50S features, yeah. And so the end result is, pretty clean code. This is just, this graph is all just sort of document. Correct me, how document is kind of clutter pretty code. But,
of course not. Just minimum C++ code and
It's productivity-wise, it's fantastic, and performance-wise, we found it works great.
So when the HTTP handler, you need to support any code that with that.
To implement an ISP handler, you don't. So, for example,
just on top of
no. So for example, let's actually do a.
We haven't seen that.
Say, for example, I want to do a